Chapter 561. Recruitment Fair. That's way too fast. Did it already circle the planet several times? Or maybe it's still there, but it's too fast for my vision to keep up. Klein's mouth twitched, deciding to wait a few seconds to see if the creature whose speed surpasses imagination would appear again. He wasn't worried that the summoned spirit world creature would harm the innocent, as one of the descriptions was of a friendly creature. Besides, as long as he forcefully ended the summoning and stopped the ritual, the creature would be immediately sent back to the spirit world, no matter where the creature whose speed surpasses imagination went. A few seconds later, Klein inhaled after failing to see any response from him waiting. He said with ancient Hermes, I end this summoning in my name. The chilling air around him instantly vanished as the swirling cold wind died down and the candle flames returned to their normal color. Klein stepped forward and extinguished the candle, intending to revise the last sentence and try again. As for the two phrases, the spirit that wanders about the unfounded, the friendly creature that can be subordinated, he had no intention of changing them. The first sentence was directed at the spirit world, and it could only be replaced with synonyms, so it didn't matter if he changed it or not. The second sentence was a prerequisite for Klein to ensure his own safety. Otherwise, it would have been a horror story instead of a hilarious one. I don't need to use surpasses imagination as an adjective. But others might not meet my needs. Perhaps I can change my train of thought. A messenger doesn't have to run that fast. A normal speed is fine. There are other ways to ensure safety. I just need to get malicious beings to ignore it and neglect it. I'll try a spirit world creature that's easily neglected. After 2 or 3 minutes of deliberation, Klein held a ritual again. When he was done with the preparations, he chanted a new incantation. I summon in my name the spirit that wanders about the unfounded, the friendly creature that can be subordinated, the being who is easily neglected. The interior of the warehouse became abnormally quiet. There was no wind, nor did it turn cold within the wall of spirituality. Even the color of the candle remained unchanged. Klein waited, watching, hoping for a good messenger. After about 10 seconds, he sighed and looked around. There's nothing. The description was of no effect this time. He didn't wait any longer and followed the procedure of ending the summoning and extinguishing the candle. To his puzzlement, the candle flame even shook a few times in the end. Did I miss something? Klein frowned, and then he relaxed, throwing the matter to the back of his mind. He reconsidered the question of how to modify the description and continued targeting the third sentence. I'll switch to another train of thought. If a messenger is especially good at enduring scuffles and has great survivability, it's still okay. No matter what, a messenger that can deliver the letter to the target is a good messenger. Klein pondered for a moment, then he held the summoning ritual for the third time. Amidst the fragrance of herbs and essential oils, and under the dim light of the candlelight, the shadows on his face darted about as his mouth gaped open and closed. I summon in my name the spirit that wanders about the unfounded, the friendly creature that can be subordinated, an extraordinary creature who has extremely high survivability. The flame of the candle flared and stretched, illuminating the bright red interior of the altar. In Klein's spirit vision, white bones drilled out from the ground, overlapping to form what looked like a safe. I've finally summoned something I can see. Furthermore, it's a creature with extremely high survivability. It looks very much like a safe. Just one look is enough to tell that it's good at taking a beating. Klein breathed a sigh of relief and spoke in the ancient Hermes. Are you willing to be my messenger? The skeletal creature that looked like a safe quickly indicated its willingness. Then it wriggled the bones beneath it and crawled toward Klein slowly, very slowly. It took 10 seconds to crawl a centimeter. This is way too slow. Klein's smile froze on his face. Although messengers completed their mission by traveling through the spirit world, that didn't mean that they didn't need speed. Within the spirit world, distance and orientation were chaotic. The most important thing was to find and lock onto a location. As long as an accurate, clear, immediate coordinates were provided, such as the summoning ritual just now or a simplified ritual that involved blowing a whistle, then no matter where the messenger was in the spirit world, it would immediately appear within the altar. When the location wasn't that immediate and only had a contractual connection or a previous anchor point, the messenger needed to spend time to distinguish the location, roam the spirit world, and search for the target. This required a certain amount of speed. If it were to deliver the letter, the recipient might not even receive it by the time they die. Klein helplessly thought as he looked at the slowly crawling skeletal creature. He let the smile reappear on his face. After some careful consideration, I think it's best I don't trouble you. Thank you for your willingness. The creature made of illusory white bones stopped. Compared to before, it appeared as though it hadn't moved at all. Klein quickly cancelled the summoning and rubbed his forehead. He was a little depressed and had decided to abandon himself to despair. He decided to use a less troublesome method to find messengers, which was public recruitment, an interview selection. After taking a deep breath, Klein calmed his mind and began the ritual seriously. Looking at the candle flame that was quietly burning, he took a step back and said, I summon in my name, the spirit that wanders about the unfounded, the friendly creature that can be subordinated, a unique being that is willing to be my messenger. Whoosh! The wind blew fiercely inside the wall of spirituality, and Klein's half-top hat almost flew off of his head. The candle flame shook and expanded to the size of a human head. It was so pale that it seemed to have lost its body temperature. A translucent head slowly emerged, as if it had just broken through a thin membrane. Its hair was a light gold color and was smooth. Its eyes were blood red, and it had an imposing appearance. Looks a little familiar, Klein silently muttered. The head had fully shown itself, but what followed wasn't its neck, but an illusory hand that held the end of the head's hair. Behind the palm were complicated patterns, but the color of the cuffs was dark. The summoned spirit world creature appeared at an increasingly rapid speed, and soon, it was before Klein in its entirety. It was indeed a familiar person. It was the headless woman that Klein had met standing at the top of a castle while he was on his way to Calvetua's ruins at the bottom of the sea. She was no longer as large as a castle like she was before. She was now a tall, ordinary woman. Of course, there were still only cuts on her neck and 4 identical heads in her hands. Did you summon me? The headless woman in the complicated black dress stood there quietly. Her 4 drooping heads spoke one after the other in ancient Faesac. She can directly communicate through words. The level of this spirit world creature isn't low. I remember you having a castle. You're already a property owner, so why are you applying for the job of a messenger? Klein sighed with emotion and lampooned. Then, he looked down at the candle behind the headless woman. He was disappointed to find that no other spirit had emerged. He had originally imagined that many spirit world creatures would be willing to be his messenger as they swarmed over, having to form a line to be interviewed. In the end, only one had responded. It should be a problem with the summoning ritual itself. It's considered a relatively simple and basic summoning ceremony, so it's impossible to summon multiple targets at once. Klein looked at the headless lady and solemnly nodded. Yes. Without waiting for the other party to speak, he added another question. Can you roam the spirit world at a relatively fast speed? How good is your survivability? The head which the headless lady lifted answered, yes. Not bad. As she spoke, she floated upwards and then quickly descended, displaying her speed. Phew. Klein decided to stop making attempts which led to unknown results. He asked in a serious manner, are you willing to sign a contract and become my messenger? The headless woman's dress fluttered slightly, and her 4 heads with blonde hair and red eyes nodded at the same time. Yes. Every time. 1 gold coin. A gold coin for each letter sent? Mr. Azik didn't mention that spirit world creatures have such hobbies. Right, he mentioned that when signing a contract, persuasion and communication are key factors. Does this mean that this is a form of persuasion and communication? Klein was surprised and wanted to cancel the summoning immediately. Wait a minute, I might not need to be the one paying for it. Whoever summons the messenger pays for it? Maybe when our communication improves, there would be the option of paying on receipt. After some thought, Klein agreed to the other party's request. Okay, let's sign the contract. He picked up a dark red round fountain pen and yellowish-brown goatskin parchment that he had prepared earlier, and he quickly wrote down the contract in the language which could stir the forces of nature, ancient Hermes. The format and terms were described in detail in Azik's letter. They were concise and to the point, and they contained clauses such as the messenger not being allowed to look at the letter, not discarding the letter, or endangering the life of the contractor. Of course, if the contents of the letter were related to the messenger had to be informed in advance. In addition to these, Klein added a clause to send 1 gold coin for each letter, specifying that it could be borne by the contractor or by the receiver of the letter. In order to ensure the effectiveness of the contract, the final part used the honorific name of the deity in charge of this domain. It was an undead contract, and normally it meant using Death's honorific name, but Death had long perished with no response from him. Hence, Azek mentioned that it could be replaced by using the description of someone high in the undead domain or the underworld itself, but the binding force wasn't that strong. Without a doubt, Klein chose the underworld, which had a close relationship with the big shot. The home of all death, the hell hidden deep within the spirit world, the witness of the decay of all living things, one that solely belongs to the kingdom of death. After penning these 4 sentences, the yellowish-brown goatskin parchment began to burn with a green flame, illuminating the gloomy surroundings. After he was done with the text, Klein took out Azek's copper whistle, placed it on the goatskin, and wrote his current name, Gehrman Sparrow. This didn't necessarily require a real name, because his aura would enter the contract. The name was only used for summoning, which was to say, using the messenger that belongs to Gehrman Sparrow worked, but the contracted creature of Klein Moretti wouldn't. When Klein finished signing, the goatskin floated up, carrying Azek's copper whistle and the dark red fountain pen, and flew to the headless lady. The headless lady held the head with golden hair and red eyes, let it bite down on the fountain pen and wrote her name, Rionette Tynker. The green flames quickly gathered together, wrapping around Azek's copper whistle and the yellowish-brown goatskin parchment. A few seconds later, the goatskin was reduced to ash, and the copper whistle fell into the palm of Klein's hand. The headless woman, Rionette, collectively blinked with the eyes of her 4 heads, and her body rapidly faded away into the pale candle flame. After the contract was made, Klein no longer needed to undo the summoning. He could do it with his own will. Phew! I finally have a messenger. The spirit that wanders about the unfounded, the friendly creature that can be subordinated, the messenger that belongs to Gehrman Sparrow. Well, when there's an opportunity, I'll get an artisan to create something like the copper whistle, so that I don't have to summon my messenger every time via a ritual. Klein cleared up the mess in a rather good mood. Over the next few days, Byam gradually returned to normal, but Dannett still hadn't been able to receive any telegrams from Admiral of Blood's pirate crew. On Sunday morning, he flipped through the newspaper and suddenly lowered his voice as he said to Klein, "There's a Beyonder gathering tonight. Want to attend?" Chapter 562. Helene Beyonder gathering? Klein thought for a bit. Then he nodded and responded, "Okay. I should bring forward to the collection of the supplementary ingredients of the Nimble-Right Master Potion. I can also see if I might meet an artisan." He subconsciously started to make arrangements in his mind. Upon seeing Gehrman Sparrow agree, Dannett breathed a quiet sigh of relief, unable to contain his joy. For the past few days, having had his bounty raised significantly, he had obediently stayed in the suite to monitor the radio transceiver. He was so bored that he yearned for the evening to arrive immediately. The Beyonder gathering that Dannett mentioned was at the Amiris Leaf Bar, where pirates, informants, and adventurers were active. It was the first choice if one wanted to gather information and buy supplies. Dressed in a black coat and silk top hat, Klein followed Dannett through the crowded bar's lobby and into a card room. Under the watchful gaze of several bouncers, he gave the predetermined signal and descended down a flight of hidden stairs to a wide underground area. It's like the Evil Dragon Bar in Tinjin City. There's an underground market for herbs, essential oils, ancient books, charms, and all sorts of common mysticism materials. However, the difference is that there are also all sorts of guns and ammunition for sale. Klein even discovered antiquated muskets and lead bullets. They also sell fake identity documents and fake seals. As expected of an overseas colony, their industry is much more developed than Tinjin's. I'll buy a batch of ingredients later to make charms in the sea god domain. There will always be some discounts if I purchase them in large quantities. Klein slightly turned his head from side to side to take in the situation in the underground area. Next to him, Dannett, who was already doubtful about his own disguise skills, had deliberately put on a cap, keeping the front of his cap down to cover half his face. With great familiarity, he led Klein to the other end of the underground market and knocked on the closed door with 2 long knocks and 4 short knocks. Behind the door, there was only a single candle. It swayed on the lampstand on the side wall, scattering yellow light onto the tiny room. Dannett pointed to the long robes, masks, and other items which were hanging or placed on a table, and said to Klein, "It's up to you to decide whether you would don a disguise. You can also choose not to." Klein looked around, his gaze sweeping past the bouncers in the room. "I don't need it. I am now an informant for the kingdom's military, and the Church of Storms also knows of my identity, so there's nothing for me to be afraid of." If the pirates and adventurers have any malicious thoughts about me because of my lack of a disguise, and if they attempt to attack me, hee. Klein suddenly pictured bounty rewards flying towards him one by one. Danitz curled his lips secretly, picked up a black iron mask, and wore it. Then, he and Klein passed through a dim corridor and into another room under a bouncer's lead. The place was lavishly decorated. The floor was covered with a thick carpet from the southern continent. The walls were decorated with shining lampstands, and the fresh smell of candles could be caught as they suffused with light. Klein glanced around and, without Danitz's help, found a brown leather sofa and sat down on it. He leaned back and crossed his right leg. There were already more than 20 people of various genders gathered here. Some were in hooded robes, while others showed their faces. According to Danitz's description in the morning, not all of the people attending this gathering were Beyonders. There were spokesmen for certain factions, as well as adventurers, pirates, and mysticism enthusiasts who wanted to become Beyonders. Time slowly passed in that quiet environment. About 7 or 8 minutes later, the old man who was sitting on a reclining chair straightened his back and crossed his hands. He chuckled. "Everyone, let's begin." Because he was old, his white hair was sparse, leaving only a thin layer. However, his light brown eyes weren't turbid, with them being bright and sharp. The organizer of the gathering, Strongman Ozeal, a famous pirate in the past, and now the secret boss of the Amiris Leaf Bar, Danitz leaned slightly and introduced the man to Klein with a suppressed voice. He'd actually mentioned it in the morning, but he was afraid that Gehrman Sparrow failed to match a name to the face and would later vent his anger on himself. It's a sorrowful matter to have a secret grasped by others. Danitz sighed inwardly. Klein nodded indiscernibly as he silently watched the transactions happen. There were potion formulas for warrior, sailor, mystery prior, and others, but no one bought them. The expectant sellers were disappointed again and again. Danitz glanced at Gehrman Sparrow, who wore an expressionless face. He then leaned over and explained in a low voice, "There is no notary at this gathering, nor any powerful seer. The authenticity of the potion formula cannot be guaranteed. It's too easy to fake such things, and even if people recognize that the formula is fake, the seller cannot be punished because he might be a victim as well." "I know. This is one of the reasons why potion formulas fail to be widely spread." Klein uncrossed his right leg, leaned forward slightly, and said in a voice that was neither loud nor low, "I need the remnant spirituality of an ancient wraith." He didn't mention the eyes of a six-winged gargoyle, the spring water from Sonia Island's Golden Spring, or any other supplementary ingredients. He was worried that others would guess that he was a faceless who was preparing to advance to Nimble Right Master. When he was in Tingen, Klein had relied on the purchase of supplementary ingredients to accurately suspect that Daxter Guderian was a prospective spectator, and thus, he figured out his identity as a member of the Psychology Alchemists. It was impossible to deduce any more from the remnant spirituality of an ancient wraith alone, as many of the rituals in the undead domain would use it. Although Klein didn't disguise himself, he still had to be careful. The room was silent for 2 seconds. Then, a slightly hoarse voice sounded. "How much do you need? Someone really has it?" Klein controlled his expression and didn't let his joy show on his face. He tilted his head to look at the speaker and saw that he was a man in his 30s who was clearly of native blood. The man's skin was bronzed, but he had a dull luster from chronic malnutrition or a lack of light. His face was thin, his cheekbones protruded, and his eyes were sunken, more white than black. "A small bottle." Klein pulled out a small metal bottle as an example. The thin, dark man was silent for a moment before saying, £500. "That's reasonable." Klein originally wanted to haggle, but he caught a glimpse of Danitz sitting beside him out of the corner of his eye. "I'm Gehrman Sparrow, a cold, crazy adventurer." Klein repeated this line 3 times inwardly, quietly took a deep breath, and calmly nodded. "Okay." He took out the large stack of cash he had prepared, and he counted out a sum of £500. The man with the mostly white eyes took out a glass test tube from his pocket, threw it at Klein, and said, "All the spirituality will be gone after a year." He wasn't afraid that the other party wouldn't be unable to catch it, because even if it were to break, it wouldn't affect the material itself. It would only be a matter of changing the container. Klein raised his right hand and accurately caught the glass tube. He saw many phosphorescent spots floating in the tube, and when they touched the glass wall, they would strangely expand, forming a face with blurred features that opened to form a mouth that screamed silently. "It's real." Klein nodded to himself and handed the thick stack of cash worth £500 to the attendant who approached and handed it to the seller. The trading continued, most of it failing with only a small number succeeding. At the end of the day, the gathering's organizer, strongman Oziel, laughed and said, "I have a request." As he spoke, he pulled out a photo from his inside pocket. "The reward for finding the person above is £1,000 or some other common beyond or ingredient of equal value. Remember, do not hurt her." £1,000? This would make most adventurers go crazy. I wonder who he's looking for, to offer such a high reward. Not surprisingly, Klein saw that everyone present was willing to give it a try. The picture began to be passed in a counterclockwise fashion, and a few minutes later, it was in Klein's hands. As he casually swept a glance over it, a bit of surprise suddenly surfaced in his heart. The woman in the photo was rather pretty, with bright red hair and a pair of green eyes that resembled emeralds. Her skin wasn't fair, but she gave off a healthy feeling. At the time of the photo shoot, she was wearing a long, lake-colored skirt. Her waist was tightened with a flower-shaped ribbon, making her appear exceptionally slender. Although her face seemed to be smiling, her overall appearance was one of displeasure and awkwardness. A girl with a good family background. Who would pay £1,000 to find her? Furthermore, the premise is that she cannot be hurt. A picture of her forcing a smile. Many romance stories with intertwined love and hate flashed in Klein's mind. Stories like a tyrannical pirate falling in love with a wealthy merchant's daughter, abducting her onto his boat before she eventually escaped, or some noble lady from a declining noble family turning into a pirate, and was later caught due to a mistake, only to have a sinful relationship with a mid- or high-ranking mandated punisher or military officer, thus escaping from her predicament and imprisonment. How a newly advanced demoness accidentally fell into a debt of love when giving someone pleasure. Such thoughts flashed through his mind, and Klein almost raised his hand to cover his face. "I've read too many novels in my previous life, and I happen to have a trauma because of demonesses in this world." He sighed to himself, looked up at Oziel and asked, "What's her name?" "Helene," Oziel answered succinctly, but she must have switched to using a fake alias. "Helene, a typical female intis name." Klein asked again, "Is there anything she often wears?" "Hair is fine too." This was a medium that could be used to seek her with divination. Klein didn't mention things like recently worn clothes that hadn't been washed, afraid that the employer behind the scenes would throw him a piece of lingerie, making it awkward. Oziel shook his head. "Nothing. She has a strong anti-tracking ability." "What's her strength like?" another member of the gathering asked. Oziel said in a serious manner, "The employer didn't give a detailed description. It said that she isn't too strong, but she's stronger than a sequence 9. You don't need to capture her. As long as you determine her whereabouts, you will be paid." Chapter 563. The Fool's Blessing. As long as you can confirm her location, you can receive £1,000. This is the first time I've seen such a mission. On the street outside the Amiris Leaf Bar, Danitz rubbed his hands together with a hint of excitement. He clenched his fists and hit the tall iron-black gas lamppost, yearning to immediately wander around the city and find the red-haired woman named Helene. To him, £1,000 wasn't a small sum. It was enough to add one more house to his line of properties in Byam. It just wouldn't be located in the most prosperous and valuable districts. The elf flying carpet he had previously obtained was only around £2,000 to £3,000, and this was the reward he had gained from fighting dangerous fellows such as Steel Mavady and Blood Brambles Hendry. It was completely incomparable to the easy mission of finding someone. Klein, who was walking ahead, held a package wrapped in newspaper. They were the charm materials which had cost him £15. He slowed his pace a little, glanced at Danitz, and spoke without expression. £5,500. Danitz's excitement froze on his face. Only then did he remember an important problem. In the eyes of the other pirates and adventurers, he was as attractive as red-haired Helene. They didn't need to fight him. Once they recognized him, they could report his identity to the military, the church, or the police, and they would receive a reward worth more than £1,000. After all, he was already a great pirate worth £5,500. Searching for red-haired Helene would be equivalent to a lady with a nice figure and good looks entering the Red Theater for entertainment. Dog shit. Danitz spat out a single word, his face grim, as he stretched out the middle consonant. At the same time, he automatically pulled down his cap even lower. Klein, who had poured cold water on Danitz, resumed his normal walking speed and considered the question of finding the red-haired Helene. The lack of a medium and the necessary information had made it difficult for him to use divination, so he had to consider other methods. Activate my underlings to do an investigation of the entire city? This is something that can only be done by the church, the military, and the police. Even the local gangs would find it difficult to accomplish. Wait, I think I can. I'm not sea god Calvetua. My believers are all across Biome and Blue Mountain Island. I just need to make an announcement, no, a revelation to all my believers, and I can get them to search for red-haired Helene. But would this damage my standing? To do something like that for 1,000 pounds, even a god wants some face. If I were the real sea god, I wouldn't care about this. However, I'm now acting as Calvetua. I have to maintain the dignity of a god as best as I can. Back when Calvetua was on the verge of collapse, it didn't even broadcast a revelation when it was urgently trying to find Letitia and her subordinates. Instead, it only gave orders to his worshippers in the upper echelons. I can change its commandments as part of reconstructing an image, but I can't appear too low class. Well, that should also be a requirement of true acting. It would be difficult to organize an investigation just by giving Kalat, Edmonton, and the others a revelation. Furthermore, they would definitely magnify the severity of the issue and cause a huge commotion. It would only make things more difficult to deal with later. There's another solution. I can throw the radio transceiver above the gray fog and attempt to contact the magic mirror, a Rhodes. I'll ask him about red-haired Helene's location. I have to be careful about this. I need to prepare ahead of time and confirm it via divination. I don't want to receive strange telegrams from the true creator or the primordial demoness. Even a glance at it would probably make me go mad. Having quickly come up with ideas, Klein boarded a rental carriage parked at the corner of the street. Danitz pressed his cap and followed closely behind. Returning to the Wind of Azure Inn, Klein took off his hat and coat while saying to Danitz, "If your captain contacts you through a dream, ask for information about red-haired Helene. She probably doesn't know. Otherwise, I would have known this red-haired Helene." Danitz grinned. "I don't know who's looking for her, to be willing to pay 1,000 pounds. His thoughts were whirling, imagining a love story akin to the ones Emperor Roselle had penned. Klein glanced at him and casually mentioned, "I'll do the monitoring tonight." "You're doing it?" Danitz snapped out of his fantasies, wondering if he had heard wrongly. "Yes." Klein nodded. "Gehrman Sparrow realizes that I'm too exhausted? Although this fellow is a little crazy, he's still a good person at heart. He had actually decided to risk his life to save those people when we were at Bansi Harbor for reasons that couldn't be considered good." Danitz sighed to himself. Carrying the radio transceiver and its relevant parts, Klein went into the bedroom, locked the door, and threw them above the gray fog with a sacrificial ritual. After doing all of this, he was in no hurry to leave the towering palace. He waved his hand, and the sea god's scepter flew out from the junk pile. He scanned through the prayers of different people and gathered experience on how people had multiple facades. In the process, he would occasionally respond, like a child who still had great interest in a new toy. As Klein's browsing drew to a close, ripples of light began to form around the seat of the fool. "Someone is praying to me, to the fool and not to see God." Klein raised his eyebrows and emanated his spirituality, scanning the scene within the rippling light. And Matt Haba, in a room with closed curtains. Dressed in a classic black robe, Ed Sheeran resisted the impulse in his heart and said to the sweet, young girl Denise, "The gift of God is in our bodies, but if we want to obtain it, we must have a teacher guide it out. Your soul is pure and beloved by the gods. I will personally guide you. In the process, no matter what happens, you must trust me and listen to me. Before that, do you have any questions?" Ed Sheeran was a swindler. His specialty was to establish a cult to cheat others for money and sex. He would then decisively flee before it reached a certain scale that would garner attention from the police. This time, he had come from Backlund, disguised as one of the fools blessed that many gangsters in the capital were looking for. He had also developed a batch of believers in his target group. He falsely claimed that the fool was the incarnation of the Lord of the Storms and that he would come to save the faithful during the apocalypse. This was a secret that could not be widely publicized and could only be spread in secret. Otherwise, it would attract the attention of the gods of the other churches. Only those who were chosen would be able to believe in the fool in advance and be the first batch of the redeemed. To make himself appear more persuasive, he spent a lot of money in Backlund, buying a piece of paper with the honorific name of the fool written on it. As for what was on the piece of paper, his comment was, "It looks like it's real." Denise asked with both fear and anticipation, "Lord Adorer, Why didn't we get a response when we read the honorific name of God? Aren't we blessed who have been selected and should bathe in God's grace? I'll immediately give you God's grace. Ed Sheeran took a deep breath and suppressed the tantalizing images in his mind. 2 reasons. First, you haven't discovered the grace of God which is hidden in your body. I will help you complete that later. Second, you are not devout enough. Don't argue, I can see right through you. After you do all of this, you will be able to recite the honorific name of God and receive a response. Just like me. Under Denise's idolizing and curious gaze, Ed Sheeran picked up a pen on the table beside her and scribbled a line of words. It was the Hermes language used for a sacrificial offering. In order to make the scam a success, Ed Sheeran had acquired a lot of religious knowledge and even went to a university's Department of History to sit in on archaeology courses. Holding the paper in front of Denise, he proudly recited the words he had written in Hermes, the fool that doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the gray fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck. Following that with half-closed eyes and open arms, he said dreamily, I feel the blessings of God. At this moment, a streak of silver lightning descended from the sky and landed right on Ed Sheeran's head. With a sizzling sound, the tiny electric bolt snaking across his body scurried. With God's blessing, he fell to the ground and his body quickly charred while his muscles twitched violently. After a few seconds, he stopped all movement, including breathing as Denise exclaimed, Lord Ed Sheeran is indeed God's blessed. Denise finally sensed that something wasn't right. She stepped forward carefully, lifted her skirt and knelt down, placing her finger to the tip of Ed Sheeran's nose. He's dead. He's dead. Denise jerked back and fell to the ground in terror. She burst into tears and stumbled out of the room, heading for the nearby police station. Atop the gray fog, Klein silently retracted the sea god's scepter. You actually dared to use my name to cheat others of their wealth and sully women. The corner of his mouth twitched, wishing he could give another bolt of lightning to that man named Ed Sheeran. This was called a corpse mutilation. The girl would probably call the police, right? This kind of case would inevitably be referred to a corresponding Beyonder team. I wonder if it will be the Nighthawks, the mandated punishers, or the machinery hive mind. After what Mr. A has done, my reputation as the fool isn't small in Backland. Perhaps I already have a dossier in the official organizations. Well, maybe they'll put everything together and hand it over to the Red Gloves or something similar for handling. Klein's past identity and insight as a Nighthawk had allowed him to consider the possible future developments. However, he quickly put this matter to the back of his mind, because no matter what, they wouldn't be able to detect that it was him. Klein threw the sea god's scepter back into the junk pile, ready to return to the real world. Suddenly, one of the dark red stars that were quietly floating in the boundless gray fog had lit up all of a sudden, emitting a light that was as bright as water. It swelled and shrunk repeatedly in an abnormally conspicuous manner. This was a crimson star that didn't belong to any member of the Tarot Club. What a busy day today. Who could it be? Like Miss Justice, Mr. Hanged Man, and Little Sun, someone is relying on a certain object to connect with the gray fog? Klein's spirituality spread out as he thought. He didn't respond and only observed. Chapter 564. Knowledge Pursuer. As Klein's spirituality made contact, the constantly expanding and contracting crimson star presented the images and sounds contained within. A black-haired woman in a classical robe had fallen to the ground, writhing in pain. She held an ordinary-looking celestial globe in one hand, and in the other, she held a short scepter that wasn't even the length of a small arm. Her strong will to survive almost broke through the binding of the crimson stars and directly entered Klein's ears. Like Justice and the Sun, this woman's figure appeared rather blurry, making it difficult to discern her exact appearance. But there were some things Klein could clearly see, such as her facial features, such as her splitting cheek muscles and the flesh inside that was contracting into eyeballs. Other features included her ears stretching outwards like a trumpet, or her fingers which were scratching at the floor to create bright streaks of blood, as well as a pair of cold, lashless eyes that were almost transparent and were situated above her. The black-haired girl's mutation didn't decline. Her body was tenaciously healing itself, causing the flesh and blood which resembled an eyeball to melt away. Her ruptured muscles fused together, and her extended ears shrunk inward. Every detail was in a repetitive seesaw-like struggle between the two states. Klein was dazzled by the illusory, lashless eyes. It was as if he had returned to Tingen, back to the time when he had first mastered spirit vision. Back then, he had seen a pair of eyes like that on old Neil's back. Hidden sage? Klein leaned back in his chair, stretched out his hand, and took hold of the sea god's scepter that once again flew out of the junk pile. He planned to lend a helping hand and smite those evil eyes with a few bolts of lightning. However, after careful examination, he sharply realized that the black-haired woman's abnormality had stemmed from the crazy ravings that no one else could hear. This was because the source of everything was in her ears, deep within her spirit body, her soul body. It's very similar to the situation when Miss Magician suffers from the ravings of the full moon. Fortunately, I'm experienced. Otherwise, I would have given the wrong response. Klein thought for a moment and thought of a way to save her. It was to pull her spirit body above the gray fog and directly block out the crazy ravings. As long as the source of the power was gone, the mutation would be quickly dealt with by the lady's self-recovery powers. As for whether she was worth saving, or if she harbored malicious intentions, the current him was no longer as troubled as he was in the past. If the black-haired lady had committed a heinous crime to a certain degree, and had already established a connection with the mysterious space above the gray fog through the Crimson Star, Klein could give her a few lightning bolts at any time and let her be thrown back to where she belonged. If she really has any kind of malicious intentions, or if she causes any accidents, I, who possess the Sea God Scepter, the Dark Emperor card, and am capable of using the Grey Fog's power to some degree, wouldn't lack the ability to resist. Klein held onto the white bone scepter in his right hand and pointed at the remote star. His spirit energy surged and poured into the crimson-red light that was like flowing water. This time, he was able to establish the mysterious and stable connection with ease. The black-haired lady's figure instantly appeared at the side of the long bronze table, sitting on a chair that didn't belong to any of the current members of the Tarot Club. As for Klein, he could see from the final image of the Crimson Stars that the mutation on her body had weakened significantly. He nodded indiscernibly, patiently waiting for the other party to speak. The black-haired lady was still somewhat adrift. 1 second, she was struggling in extreme pain, with her vision gradually turning black, and the next second, she was inside a towering domed palace. Beneath her was an endless and silent gray fog that extended outwards endlessly. How couldn't she be taken aback? After a brief moment of silence, she turned her gaze to the figure leisurely sitting at the very end of the mottled long table. She asked with an ethereal voice, "Is this the underworld?" "You aren't dead." Klein laughed. At this moment, he saw that the symbol tainted with starlight quickly changed on the back of the black-haired lady's high-back chair, forming a pair of eyes that contained countless resplendent stars. They were cold and indifferent, and they lacked eyelashes. Based on his past experiences, he believed that this was a symbol representing the mystery prior pathway. The black-haired lady froze, gradually regaining her senses. Instinctively, she scanned her surroundings before finally casting her gaze at the mysterious man shrouded behind the gray fog. White shirt, tailcoat, no tie, black pants, bright leather boots, seemingly black hair, and a blurry appearance. There's nothing strange about this. He casually holds a milky white scepter that's slightly longer than an arm in his hand, and that scepter. The black-haired lady's pupils contracted as the depths of her eyes reflected, in its entirety, the blue gemstones and the aura of a storm from the surroundings that it stirred. Furthermore, there were countless points of light that surrounded it, giving it a holy and majestic feeling. It's a scepter at the demigod level. He's playing with it like it's a toy. He doesn't care about it at all. The lady in black narrowed her eyes and cautiously asked, "How may I address you?" "You may call me Mr. Fool," the experienced Klein answered. "The Fool." The black-haired lady ruminated over the word before asking with deliberation, "I've heard of your honorific name from the Aurora Orders, Mr. Z." She waited for his assertion or denial. "You know the Aurora Orders, Mr. Z. He can be considered an old friend." Klein laughed but didn't reply. Instead he said, "Do you not plan on introducing yourself? This is the most basic of etiquette." The black-haired lady recalled what had happened to her and fell silent again. After a few seconds, she said in a slightly muffled voice, "My name is Katlia, and I have the nickname Admiral of Stars." "Mr. Fool, were you the one who saved me?" "Admiral of Stars?" "The Admiral of Stars, one of the 7 pirate admirals. Someone with a bounty of 37,000 pounds? I've saved a treasure trove, no. A person of high status." Klein shifted in his seat slightly, half surprised, half amused. He chuckled and replied, "Wasn't that obvious?" Admiral of Stars Katlia immediately stood up and said, "Thank you for your assistance. If you have anything you need me to do, you can directly instruct me, as long as it is within my capabilities and doesn't violate my principles." "That's nice of you. Very seasoned and experienced. She's indeed worthy of being the well-known Admiral of Stars. Klein couldn't help but sigh. Among his tarot club members, with the exception of the Hanged Man and his incarnation, the World, all of them were rather inexperienced when they first participated. Miss Justice was one of those who vaguely understood the mysterious world, but she hadn't really stepped into it yet. The Sun was one of those who received sufficient education, but due to the isolated environment and his relatively young age, he was very simple and honest. The Magician may have been stuck at Sequence 9 for several years, but she had always been an unaffiliated Beyonder. She didn't know much about all sorts of hidden factions, and she lacked experience. The Moon, Emlyn, comes from a Beyonder race, with a faction with a deep heritage backing him. However, due to his preference of staying home to play with dolls, he is greatly lacking in experience in certain aspects. He was very gullible as a result. That fellow Emlyn is smart, but if he were to, meet Triss no Demonis Trissi, he would be tricked by her into selling his dolls. Klein secretly teased the vampire, which could be considered a friend in the real world. He looked at Admiral of Stars and didn't directly respond to the matter of her repaying him for saving her life. Instead, he smiled and asked, "Are you a member of the Moses Ascetic Order?" "Yes." Katlia didn't believe that this was something she could hide from Mr. Fool. Klein smiled. "What did you just do to provoke that guy?" He wasn't sure that the pair of eyes belonged to the hidden sage, so he used a vague term, "that guy," instead, so that, no matter what, the Fool was absolutely correct and upheld his standing. After a moment of silence, Katlia said, "No, I didn't provoke him." She paused, then she continued, "The members of the Moses Ascetic Order believe that all objects are numeric, and we pursue knowledge itself. However, Emperor Roselle once said that we aren't pursuing knowledge, but that knowledge is pursuing us. The hidden sage is an embodiment of knowledge itself. He is chasing us, every single Moses Ascetic Order member. When too much knowledge is injected into us, without us being able to quickly digest and master it, a situation like before would happen. Either I lower my defenses and open my mind to accept the modifications from the hidden sage, or I would tenaciously resist it or end up losing control. If that's the case, you aren't specifically targeted by the hidden sage. Even if you managed to escape from the previous predicament, you wouldn't be suspected of anything. According to what you said, you are very knowledgeable. Back then, Old Neil only wanted to obtain the knowledge of human body refining and of a perfect revival." Klein suddenly sighed, but he didn't show it on his face. The reputation of Admiral of Stars isn't too bad. She's the kind of pirate with a code of honor. Klein stopped his thoughts and calmly said, "If something similar happens again, you can recite my name." "Recite your name." Katlia's lips quivered, instinctively wanting to refuse. In the end, she didn't say anything as she fell silent for a long time. After repeatedly weighing the pros and cons, she stood up, crossed her arms in front of her chest, and slightly bowed as she said, "How may I be of service?" Klein laughed and said in an indifferent tone, "In the future, provide some assistance to my blessed. By your will." Katlia sat down again and asked cautiously, "Is the honorific name provided by Mr. Z yours?" She then repeated the honorific name of the Fool to him. Klein nodded his head, indicating that she was right. Katlia looked at the other empty seats and asked after some deliberation, "Honorable Mr. Fool, will there be others here as well?" Klein laughed and replied, "People like yourself. They set up a regular gathering, and I bear witness." After a few seconds of silence, Katlia asked, "Can I participate?" She thought that since she wasn't connected with the mysterious existence known as the Fool, it was better to know more than to do nothing. "Of course you have money, knowledge, influence, and needs." Klein casually leaned against the back of the chair. "Sure. Without my permission, you are not to leak this matter." "All right," Katlia answered without hesitation. Klein tapped his left index finger and revealed the rest of the tarot cards on the bronze table. They used tarot cards as their code names. "These are the remaining ones. Pick one." Katlia scanned the cards and immediately said, "The Hermit." Chapter 565. Eye of Mystery. Prying inside the captain's cabin, Katlia slowly got up from the floor and walked in silence to the full-length mirror next to the bookcase. In the mirror, the skin on her face was fair and smooth, without a single crack. Her ears were small and normal, showing no signs of expanding. Her deep purple eyes were calm, as if nothing had happened. However, she could see more with her eyes that carried a sense of mystery. Hidden beneath her skin were eye-like flesh and blood that hadn't fully dissolved,
Her soul body, whose pain and madness were rapidly dispersing. Innumerable illusory objects with ineffable forms that roamed about. Sailors who were cleaning the deck several rooms away. Everything within a range of a few dozen meters was revealed to her in an unobscured but unusually chaotic manner. From the day she had become a Sequence 5 Constellations Master, her mystery prior powers had been greatly enhanced. She could faintly see that there were thick curtains around her that resembled shadows, and behind the curtains, something seemed to be watching her and all living beings. There are no traces of being influenced by Mr. Fool, which in turn explains many things. He was able to directly pull my soul body into that mysterious space with a strange tyrannical and secretive power. It's not something that a demigod scepter can compare to. Although he was dressed in contemporary clothing, this doesn't mean anything. For an existence at this level, it's very easy for different people to see him in different forms, and his true appearance would probably cause every person that sees him directly to lose control and die. Katlia stared at herself in the mirror, thinking silently about what had just happened. It was inevitable that she had some predictions about Mr. Fool's identity, but this was only guesswork without any evidence. The fact that he is wearing a tailcoat doesn't mean that he is very young or that he was born recently. Perhaps his essence is ancient, even older than the 7 gods. The knowledge that is pursuing me tells me that before the cataclysm, there were indeed older gods, and he might be one of them, Katlia said silently to herself before turning away from the full-length mirror and walking back to the place where she had struggled in pain. She picked up her glasses that had fallen to the side. She put the thick glasses on her nose, hiding her deep purple eyes. Everything that didn't appear under a normal person's vision quickly disappeared from her sight. Katlia stood there, thinking again about the influence Mr. Fool and the so-called Tarot Club would have on her. Unknowingly, a tall figure surfaced in her mind. The words that she would never forget had once again echoed in her ears. "Leave. Your destiny doesn't lie with me." "Is this my destiny, Your Majesty?" She closed her eyes. In the ancient and majestic palace above the grey fog, Klein's fingers tapped the edge of the long mottled table as he made all the tarot cards on the table disappear. He was thinking about what the subsequent developments would be after the Admiral of Stars joined the Tarot Club. If there's no other way, and if I might really need to take a detour from a safe sea route and enter the sea that was once a battlefield of the gods, to search for singing mermaids, having the hermit, who is fearful of the fool, in my control is better than cooperating with Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina. Using her ship would be much safer. Yes, Mr. Hanged Man will be a backup choice. Admiral of Stars is a Moses Ascetic Order member. She grasps plenty of knowledge and is very helpful towards the Tarot Club, but it's a latent risk for me. Mr. Fool's image is built on the foundation of being unfathomable. In the future, I have to be more careful. I mustn't answer things I'm not sure of. On matters I'm unconfident about, I'd rather be vague and handle matters like a charlatan. Of course, to fully resolve this problem, I should quickly improve myself and become a high sequence beyonder. My strength needs to match my level, and my standards need to match that pedestal. With such a Sequence 5 powerhouse with many subordinates under her, the overall strength of the Tarot Club isn't considered low. After obtaining the Sea God Scepter, I don't have to worry that members of the Tarot Club will be too strong, with problems easily arising. I hope that there will come a day when this member of the Moses Ascetic Order, Admiral of Stars, will be able to play an important role in my revenge against the hidden sage. Klein exhaled as he vanished from above the grey fog. Backlund. Beneath St. Samuel Cathedral. A red-gloved nighthawk entered the temporary office assigned to them, with a telegraph in hand. "Captain, something happened at Enmat Harbor," he said to Solashura Soest with some excitement. Soest touched the right side of his hair and asked, "What happened?" "There's a new development from the Fool, the one the Aurora Order is seeking." The member holding the telegraph handed the piece of paper over. His answer immediately attracted the attention of several red gloves who were present, including the man with black hair and green eyes who was taking an afternoon nap with his chair lifted up and his feet on the table. He had covered his face with his hat. Soest took over the telegraph and scanned it before immediately laughing. Someone lied by claiming to be his blessed in an attempt to scam others, but after chanting his name, he was smote to death on the spot by a bolt of lightning. There really is a hidden existence known as the Fool. The files relating to the tarot ritual and the Fool had been handed over to Soest's Red Gloves team. They were in charge of the investigations, but there were no leads, and they didn't put much emphasis on it because they had other missions on hand. The Fool has powers in the lightning domain? Leonard Mitchell removed the black hat from his face. Who knows?
If he's the embodiment of some old friend of ours, it's possible to do something similar by preparing a corresponding mystical item. It's not without precedent. This is especially so for the fake gods in the southern continent and the colonial islands. Holy Lord of Storms. Those cheats claim that the Fool is another manifestation of the Lord of Storms. This might also be why he was smitten to death. Soest leisurely threw the telegraph aside. Leonard glanced at it, lowered his feet, half-turned, and chuckled. Aren't we going to perform some investigations? How? Are you going to feign ignorance and recite his honorific name? Soest sneered. This has a high probability of catching the tail of the Fool, but I will basically be bidding farewell to this world. My digestion of the nightmare potion has been going pretty well, and I just got another good item. There are still plenty of sequences up ahead which are waiting for me. How can I enter into an eternal sleep so soon? Leonard stroked his drooping hair strands and said, We can get a few criminals on death row to give it a try? But he could just as easily not respond. Soest shook his head. We can start from the 2 cases that involve the tarot rituals. I'm more and more convinced that it has something to do with the Fool. Firstly, the Fool is one of the major arcana tarot cards. Secondly, the organization that is seeking or cracking down on his blessed is the Aurora Order. And the first case that involved the tarot ritual is the Lenevis case. As such, the Aurora Order's attempt to allow the true creator's descent was foiled. Lenevis pulled at his black vest and got up. Soest thought about it seriously and said, The clues from the other cases happen to have been cut off as well. For now, we have nothing else to do. You can try to investigate the 2 tarot ritual cases. Sure. Leonard smiled back. This was exactly what he wanted.
With a case that no one cared about being handed to him, he had won a certain amount of time to act freely.
At 2:50 p.m. Furs returned from the cold streets to her residence while trembling. It wasn't that she wanted to go out in this damp, cold weather, but it was that she had run out of food at home. As for Zio, she had gone all the way to Pritz Harbor to capture a fugitive and collect the bounty. It was unknown when she would be able to return home. She's always instinctively chasing after and capturing fugitives. It can be said that she has been acting in some way. Holding the large brown paper bag in her arms, she habitually fished for her keys to open the mailbox and take out the letters and bills. She entered the house, put the food away, and took off her thick coat that tightly clung to her body. Furs began to look through the letters. Suddenly, her eyes lit up. There was a letter from her teacher, Dorian Gray. After she advanced to Trickmaster, the first thing she did was to write about it in her letter and mail it to Dorian Gray, hoping to receive her teacher's praise and subsequent guidance. However, days had passed without her receiving a reply. For a moment, she wondered if she should visit Pritz Harbor out of concern. Furs quickly opened the envelope and began to read through it. I'm sorry that I have only replied now. I previously left Pritz Harbor for some time for a relative's funeral. Your talent leaves me gratified. Perhaps the stories hidden in your heart have helped you in acting. After you digest the Trickmaster potion, I'll provide you with the Sequence 7 astrologer formula and some ingredients, as well as a gift. The crux when it comes to acting as a Trickmaster lies in performing and hoodwinking. Hoodwinking can also be replaced with deceit. This has been verified by generations of Beyonders. You can take into consideration other pathways like Swindler and Magician. The meaning behind their names is, in some sense, similar. Furs heaved a sigh of relief, glanced up at the wall clock, and hurried back to her bedroom before locking the door behind her. The weekly tarot gathering was beginning. Not long after, a crimson light flooded her eyes, drowning everything.
In the ancient and mysterious palace, just as Furs was about to look at Mr. Fool, she suddenly saw a figure beside her.
That seat had always been empty. A new member? A lady? The magician Furs moved her eyeballs slightly, pretending not to care as she half-turned her body. Another new member? And it's a lady. Miss Justice was about to get up and greet Mr. Fool when she saw an unfamiliar figure. While feeling puzzled and expectant, she discovered a problem. The women were on one side of the table, while the men were on the other side. This should be divided according to Mr. Fool's intentions. I wonder if there's any symbolic meaning behind it. Yes, the ladies are on the left, and the men are on the right. Being neither left or right is what defines a god like Mr. Fool. Ah, yes, there's also Mr. World. Heh. Could it be that he's neither man or woman, or even a human? Audrey, you're thinking too much. Justice stood up and bowed, speaking with a light and brisk tone.
Good afternoon, Mr. Fool. Chapter 566. The details of clothes. Klein's lips curled up in a slight nod in response to Miss Justice's pleasant greeting. He was just about to introduce the hermit to everyone, and everyone to the hermit, when he noticed that Miss Justice didn't stop. Her gaze shifted to the other side as she greeted. Good afternoon, Mr. Hanged Man. This time, she didn't follow the order of the tarot cards but followed the order in which the person joined the tarot club. After this round of greetings, the hermit will essentially get to know everyone, and there's no need for the fool to introduce her. Miss Justice is obviously doing it on purpose. She's really considerate. As long as a beyonder of the spectator domain gets serious, they act differently for matters like this. Klein was surprised for a moment before he praised her silently. At the same time, Alger responded to Audrey's greeting while cautiously sizing up the new member. Female. It's barely possible to tell that she's wearing a black gown with many patterns on it. Her hair is black and her eyes are a little purple. Alger managed to find certain traits in her blurred, distorted image. Suddenly, his heart sank as he recalled the scene he saw a few months ago at the pirate convention. Back then, scattered starlight had magically formed a long bridge between the huge sailboat and the palace in the depths of the island. Admiral of Stars Katlia, who was wearing a black classical robe, had walked in midair, carrying a celestial globe and a short scepter by her waist. And the celestial globe resembled the strange weather bottle that Alger had previously received. The latter had coincidentally shattered after he had been pulled into the gathering by Mr. Fool. Could it be her? She looks somewhat similar based on her attire. But the Admiral of Stars wears glasses, while she doesn't. It cannot be confirmed. It'll require further observation and evidence. Unfortunately, I only saw her from afar and know little. Regardless, I should be careful. When exchanging information, I should try my best to avoid divulging details about my actual situation. The world is Mr. Fool's blessed. Letting him know of my identity is totally different compared to the others. No, the other members. After the matter regarding the sea god, Mr. Fool has recovered a considerable amount of strength. He's even able to pull in a powerhouse like a pirate admiral? Thoughts flashed through Alger's mind as he slightly fidgeted in his seat. Mr. Hanged Man's body language tells me that he is alert and guarded. Does he know the female newcomer, or has he guessed something? How intriguing. Audrey's gaze swept across without leaving a trace and landed on Derek. At this moment, Katlia was also carefully and seriously examining the members of the tarot club in the order they were greeted in. The mysterious purple color in her eyes slowly flowed in an indiscernible fashion. Although she couldn't truly see through the blurry concealment of the fog, she could still make out the details of their clothing. The Hanged Man, a man in his prime, in his 30s, and has messy hair like seaweed with a rare deep blue color. This is a common mutation seen in the sailor pathway. He's wearing a robe with the patterns of storms and waves. Someone from the Church of Storms? Katlia's pupils contracted. She didn't show any abnormalities as she continued to observe the rest of the members. The son, a young male, perhaps still underage. His attire is rare and has a simple ancient sense of beauty. It's very tight, making it suitable for combat. Is he a beyonder in this aspect? The world. Neither an old man nor a young man. He has a gloomy temperament and wears a hooded robe. He has a feeling as though he's not a living person. Is this something similar to Senor or Steel Mavedi? Or some other sequence I'm unaware of? The magician, a young woman, wears a common lone-style dress. Apart from having a trait of languidness, she doesn't have any other characteristics. This kind of person is the easiest to ignore, so she needs to have more attention paid to her. The moon, a young man. He sits very casually. Black hair, red eyes, and wears an Earth Mother priest robe. There seems to be only one possibility for such a combination. A vampire. As expected, the members of Mr. Fool's Tarot Club aren't that simple. Just a preliminary judgment involves two churches. Katlia withdrew her gaze and met Audrey's gaze. Sensing the other party's intention to ask, she nodded lightly. The hermit. Katlia had spoken in ancient Feysak, deliberately avoiding the more familiar languages of Intis and Lone, as she had done so back when she was communicating with Mr. Fool. And she had noticed one thing. Mr. Fool had previously told her that the time the gathering was being held was at 3 p.m. on Monday, Backlund time. Does this mean that the members of this gathering are currently predominantly made up of people from Lone? Katlia made her own judgment. Justice. Audrey smiled faintly in return. Good afternoon, ma'am hermit. She had noticed what the hermit had been up to and had summarized the person's traits in her heart. She's a very cautious woman who has rich experience in the beyonder world. She's quiet but not introverted, and she's very confident in her observation skills or certain abilities related to her eyes. Furthermore, her clothing style and the short scepter hanging at her waist indicates that her sequence pathway leans towards mystery. This requires confirmation. Perhaps it's just a hobby. At the same time, Katlia also managed to clearly make out Miss Justice's clothing. She wears 2 hanging earrings, and the earrings are small and exquisite, inlaid with very high-quality emeralds which accentuate her emerald green eyes. They're obviously worth a lot. The necklace around her neck looks unique. It's lined with diamonds that are quite difficult to count, but it's nothing ostentatious. Her milky white dress is simple yet beautiful. It's tailored to be elegant and befitting of her status, like the work of a stylish designer. As she went through the details, Katlia couldn't help but close her eyes. A 17 to 18-year-old girl. Very rich. The way she moves and her etiquette makes her highly suspect to be a noble with high status. A lone noble? Katlia didn't know why she sighed in her heart. After a round of greetings from Audrey, there was no need for Klein to introduce the original members of the Tarot Club to the hermit or the hermit to the rest. Just as she sat down, Audrey once again turned to the very end of the long bronze table. Mr. Fool, I'm out of town and have only managed to find 1 page of Roselle's diary. At the last gathering, she had provided 2 pages, so she was 2 pages short of paying off the debt. However, with her being in the manor, even if she often went to the city, all she managed was to collect 1 diary page. In addition, due to the addition of the new member, Hermit, she was careful not to mention the psychology alchemists. She didn't mention Backlund or East Chester County at all. Roselle's diary. Diary? Katlia almost lost control and couldn't help quickly turning her head to look at Miss Justice, who sat on the same side as her. She clearly remembered that the tall and beautiful figure had once sighed. It's not a notebook. It's his diary. However, other than him, no one else would be able to understand it. The members of the Tarot Club know that Roselle's notebook is a diary? Mr. Fool is collecting Roselle's diary? Is he trying to crack it to find the secret hidden in that part of history? This is more like a revived ancient god. All sorts of confused and shocked thoughts surfaced in Katlia's mind. She maintained her staidness, just turning her head in a normal fashion to observe the first transaction. After experiencing many things and trudging her way towards becoming one of the 7 great pirate admirals, she understood that the most important thing for her to do after joining the Tarot Club was to listen more and speak less. Mr. Fool, I received 3 pages, Fur said with a smile. They had been mailed by Dorian Gray. At last week's gathering, as she hadn't received her teacher's response, and due to the cold weather, she hadn't attended any Beyonder gatherings, so she couldn't provide a single page. Derek followed immediately. Mr. Fool, I've copied a new legend of the ancient gods. TSK, he's always using the legends of ancient gods as a perfunctory payment. Emlyn glanced contemptuously at the sun suddenly. He thought of something. Although the sun claimed that the one they worshipped was the Lord that created everything, he had never tried to cover up the influence that Giant King, Ormer, had on them. However, he had never mentioned that Giant Queen Omabella was who the Kingdom of Silver originally believed in. Could it be that the City of Silver isn't equal to the Kingdom of Silver? I'll wait a minute and try it out. Emlyn had never been able to get over the sun's earlier slandering of the Sanguine. For pages of Roselle's diary, a legend of the ancient gods. That's pretty good. I wonder if it contains information about the High Elf, Kohainum. Alas, after Mr. Hanged Man learned that the world is a blessed, I cannot make the world ask questions without any qualms. Klein thought quickly and said with a chuckle, very good. He helped Miss Justice, Miss Magician, and Little Sun conjure their respective content, which flashed into the palm of his hand as he casually browsed through them. Mr. Fool doesn't seem to be deciphering it. He can read Emperor Roselle's diary? What's his background? What is his true identity? A sense of indescribable terror and dread suddenly welled up in Katlia's heart. She quickly retracted her gaze and looked at the long bronze table, as if she was memorizing the simple patterns on the table's surface. The reaction the hermit showed when realizing that Mr. Fool is able to read Roselle's diary exceeded my imagination. Is she concerned with this matter, or is it somehow related to her? Audrey pursed her lips thoughtfully. Although the other party hit it quickly and naturally, this was still obvious enough for a sequence 7 from the spectator pathway. Klein sensed the abnormality of the new member, the hermit, because he also wanted to see how this member of the Moses ascetic order, who had a great deal of knowledge, would react to it.
The result left him surprised. Isn't that a little too intense?
Klein didn't have the luxury of time to think about it as his gaze fell to the first page of Roselle's diary.
Chapter 567. Source of the matter, April 4th. I just returned from Countess Warinka's masquerade party when I suddenly felt an emptiness in my heart. One woman after another. The monotonous and mechanical movements, the indistinguishable smell of perfume, and the warmth from the entanglement of their limbs. All these in exchange for a few seconds of pleasure, followed by endless boredom, disgust, emptiness and numbness. What pleasure is there in such a life? Is the meaning of life to just do this every single day? I can't go on like this. I have to get out of this sorry state. Also, I need to remind myself that I shouldn't habitually write Arabic numerals. Emperor, there are actually times when you reflect on yourself and act like a hipster? This doesn't fit with my image of you. Klein almost pricked his brows up. He looked down at the second entry of the diary. April 4th, Countess Warinka invited me to a private salon, and she told me that Ma'am Julia would be there too. Will this conservative blonde girl who had come to loan because of her marriage participate as well? I really look forward to it. I've been imagining her in bed for a long time. I hope her husband, Viscount Helene, doesn't mind. Emperor, have you forgotten what you wrote a few days ago in your diary? TSK. How nice, isn't it? Also, you have a typo. Mine. Klein couldn't help but lampoon. April 14th. I've been attending too many events recently, and the flesh is weak even though the spirit is willing. But that's nothing. Although I'm still young, I should be careful about the risk of retrograding. Temperance. The archaeologist's sequence has improved my physique and effectively enhanced a certain degree of my powers. However, this isn't its area of expertise, but just something that comes with it. As I continue raising my sequence, the changes from the previous potions will also intensify. This is my motivation. Apparently, apothecaries can concoct medicine that lacks side effects. Perhaps I should ask a few of them. Also, I really have to control myself. Unrestrained behavior will only lead to continuous increases in the threshold, and the degree of satisfaction wouldn't be like how it would normally be. After calming down and thinking about it carefully, there are many things that can be done. Humans are always like this, bound by desire, unable to see what's of value. Why did I transmigrate over here? What secrets lie hidden in the depths of the stars above my head? Where did the original consciousness come from? And if self-cognition purely comes from one's consciousness, then who was I before I had the identity of Huang Tao? Who does the essential part belong to? Emperor, are you describing to me what it means to be a pervert and philosopher before and after the deed? So you do have worries about such matters. I thought you were already fixed in certain traits. Thankfully, you didn't teach Chinese to your children. Yes, you likely didn't teach them. Otherwise, what would they think after seeing such content? Zeratul prophesied that your eldest daughter, Bernadette, would be at odds with you and betray you. It's not without reason. Of course, not teaching them is more of a form of protection. Klein was successfully amused by Roselle's diary entries, but he didn't show it on his face. To him, the diary of Emperor Roselle was both a book of knowledge and a collection of jokes. With this thought, Klein turned to the next page of the diary. October 2nd, Zeratul came to visit me again. Now that I've become a demigod, he wishes that I can honor a promise. He wishes to steal that dangerous sealed artifact from the church. That is a grade 1 sealed artifact, the Antigonus family's notebook from the 4th epoch. At this point, Klein's pupils contracted uncontrollably. This was likely the notebook that the secret order lost later on. This was likely the notebook that led to Klein Moretti's death and how he, Zhou Mingrue, had used Klein Moretti's corpse to successfully awaken in this world. This was the source of everything. It turns out that it didn't fall into the hands of the secret order from the very beginning. Instead, it was sealed within the Church of the God of Craftsmanship, which later turned into the Church of the God of Steam and Machinery. Zeratul successfully obtained it through Emperor Roselle. Right, the secret order member inside Creeping Hunger was very fearful of Zeratul. He believed that Zeratul is an undying and abnormal monster. Does this mean that Zeratul gained benefits through the notebook, but an accident happened? He turned from a person who could communicate normally with Roselle into a monster. Therefore, this eventually led to the loss of the Antigonus family's notebook? Of course, it cannot be ruled out that Zeratul deliberately allowed it to be lost. Yes. As Zeratul became a monster, the secret order lost all the mermaids, causing subsequent faceless beyonders to risk their lives out at sea? Rosago succeeded because he attempted to enter that sea which is a ruin of a battle between gods? All of these thoughts flashed through Klein's mind, causing his heart to feel abnormally heavy.
He didn't assume that the Antigonus notebook that he had encountered was closely related to Roselle, because the theory he always had stemmed from the law of convergence of beyonder characteristics, and that some of the details that followed were in line with similar logic.
Are they all involved with the upper echelons of the seer pathway? Klein glanced over the palace and took in the endless gray fog. Could it be the cause? He asked himself this question once more from the bottom of his heart. Steadying his emotions, Klein went on to read the subsequent diary pages. I'll have to do it depending on the situation. If it's easy to steal and there's no risk of exposure, I'll try to do it. Otherwise, I'll pretend as though none of this ever happened. It doesn't matter even if Zeratul were to expose me.
With my present identity, status, sequence, and influence, as long as I'm willing to repent, the church won't do anything to me.
The other 2 diary pages recorded Roselle's train of thought towards constructing his plans to steal the notebook, but none of them seemed likely to succeed.
However, Klein knew that Roselle eventually obtained the notebook and handed it over to the head of the secret order, Zeratul.
After a moment's thought, Klein turned the page. December 10th. I once again attended that ancient and secret gathering. At the gathering, I discovered that they were unanimous in being extremely hostile to the Solomon Empire of the 4th epoch. I raised the question which Mr. Hermes quickly answered. In the 4th epoch, the ally and supporter of the Solomon Empire was the true creator. This is very real.
I resisted the urge to ask what exactly our organization had done in the history of the 4th epoch, but as I left the palace and returned from my dreams, I found that Mr. Hermes's route this time coincided with mine to a certain extent.
This ancient man who lived since the cataclysm definitely knew more. I built up a rapport with him and earnestly asked him the question. Is that why the organization hates the true creator? Is it solely because he had used the creator's holy name in his name? Mr. Hermes chuckled and said that they weren't such superficial creatures. He asked me in return if I knew what the actual abilities of the shepherd were. Of course, was my answer.
He asked again in a profoundly meaningful manner, who do you think would be most likely to develop in the direction of being omniscient and omnipotent among all the present gods?
The
first thought that came to me was a shepherd pathway which could engage in devouring and grazing, so as to control the souls and characteristics of other beyonders.
So that's the reason. This page only had this diary entry, but it contains a lot of information. The Solomon Empire originally came under the true creator's camp. Yes, in the Tudor family's underground ruins, there are humanoid statues of the 6 true gods. Although it isn't certain whether they were worshipping or desecrating the gods, one thing is certain. The 6 gods were involved in the affairs of the 3 empires, and they later had a close relationship with the Trunsoist dynasty. Did the 3 great empires represent 3 different camps of gods? Klein tried to use his archaeological discovery and historical knowledge to decipher the hidden truth of the previous epoch, but he was still shrouded in fog. Towards Hermes, the oldest master of mysticism, Klein's answer came close to Roselle's. As a beyonder sequence was raised, the saints and angels of the shepherd pathway were able to engage in the grazing of more souls, gaining more and more beyonder powers. In the end, if the true creator had finished grazing the other 21 beyonder pathways, he would be, to some extent, the omnipotent and omniscient creator. There are still a lot of secrets hidden in the sequence pathways. Klein turned to the 4th page. This diary page recorded the actions Roselle took after he consumed the savant potion.
He read a lot, studied a lot, tamped down on his foundation very firmly, and increased the scope and depth of his knowledge to a whole new level.
In this period of time, he had almost no entertainment. Learning was his greatest form of entertainment.
In one of the diary entries, he wrote, "When a person knows with certainty how much he will gain after putting in the effort, and is able to directly tell how much he gains, then he will certainly work as hard as I am now."
Isn't this the fundamental attraction of many games? Klein turned over the last diary page and read the legend of the ancient gods provided by Little Sunday. During the entire process, the majestic palace was completely silent. Be it justice or the moon, they were both considering what to trade and communicate later on. It was the first time that the hermit Katlia had encountered such a situation, but she didn't feel uneasy or uncomfortable at all. Instead, she carefully analyzed the information that the scene revealed. This isn't the first time this is happening. Mr. Fool has the habit of reading Roselle's diary at the tarot gathering. The members will proactively or passively search for the pages for him. However, it can't be confirmed if there were any advance payments. He really can read Roselle's diary. He's searching for secrets that have sunken in the river of history? Just now, that son mentioned that the information he handed in was about legends of ancient gods. This is roughly in line with my previous speculations. At this point in time, Klein had roughly finished reading the new piece of information regarding ancient gods. In the second epoch, in those dark years, every ancient god had a god attached to them. Just like the dragon of imagination Ankwelt and his child, the dragon of nightmare, Alzahad. Chapter 568. Subsidiary gods. In the information provided by the Sun, there were detailed examples of some typical subsidiary gods, but most of the information didn't provide their true names, only their titles. These included the god of beauty and the goddess of life, who were subsidiaries to vampire ancestor, Lilith, the goddess of misfortune and the god of the dead, who were subsidiaries to annihilation demonic wolf, Phlegria, the god of luck and the queen of calamity, who were subsidiaries to elf king, Siniathrim, and so on and so forth. Queen of Calamity. Klein suddenly thought of the Book of Calamity, and the golden wine cup he had taken from the ruins of the High Elf. The name Kohinum and the word Calamity was engraved on it in Elvish. This caused him to make the connection that Kohinum was the Elf King's subsidiary. Queen of Calamity. Unfortunately, I can't directly seek confirmation with Little Sunday. I'll have to wait for further information from him. Klein sighed silently. At the same time, he made some theories about the fact that these titles didn't correspond with their true names. The City of Silver was originally the Kingdom of Silver that came under the Giant King's court's rule. Other than having sufficient understanding of its own forces and enemies, the information regarding the other ancient gods will only come from legends and rumors, and they aren't that detailed. Compared to the simple and easy-to-understand titles, a god's true name can consist of complicated and difficult words to remember, which can make it harder for them to be spread. The information provided to Klein when he turned over the page confirmed his theory. However, it gave him new doubts. The dragons also had a dragon of wisdom, which was the equivalent of a god in the City of Silver, called Heraburgen, and under Giant King Ormer, there was also his eldest son, the god of dawn, Badheilbrunn, and his queen, the goddess of harvest. Why doesn't the goddess of harvest have a real name? Isn't she the queen of the Giant King's court? The City of Silver should have records of it. These so-called subsidiary gods are equal to the angels or king of angels of later times. Yes, the sequence 2 of their pathway, and sequence 1s of the other pathways? Klein suppressed his perplexion and inferred the truth from the information recorded in the card of blasphemy. Within the same pathway, if there was a sequence 0, then there wouldn't be a sequence 1, and if there was no sequence 0, then there would be at most 3 sequence 1s. However, Klein didn't dare to base his judgment on this. After all, his knowledge was partial, and he didn't even know if there were any preconditions for the sequence 0 and sequence 1, which was derived from the law of beyonder characteristics conservation and indestructibility. I'll assume this for the time being. Klein leaned back, letting the information in his hands disappear, smiling as he said, "You may begin." At this point, Alger was still seriously examining himself. After considering how to communicate properly, he used the technique of being in the other person's shoes. He started from the point of view of the hermit, who was suspected of being Admiral of Stars, to see what exactly he had exposed. Mr. Fools protects every member's true identity with a blurred and distorted image, but this method doesn't affect the representation of colors. Dark brown colors can be difficult to distinguish, but bright colors are easily grasped. At the very least, I can tell that Miss Justice is blonde with bright green eyes. And for me, the most obvious thing I can't hide is my dark blue hair. But this doesn't say anything. It's not a problem to say that dark blue hair is a common mutation in Beyonders within the Sailor pathway. But the converse isn't true. This is because such traits are hereditary. On Sonia Island and in the Berserk Sea around Desi Bay, they were places where elves originally gathered. Many humans with traces of elvish blood will also have dark blue hair. It's the same for districts where there are a certain number of Church of Storms Beyonders. Ignoring any other trait, it's difficult for the hermit to determine any further information based on the situation. Just as Alger heaved a sigh of relief, he caught sight of the storm robe he was wearing. After returning to the Blue Avenger, not only was he the captain of the ship, but he was also the bishop of the sailors. He often needed to wear the corresponding clothes to celebrate Massachusetts. If he didn't show his devotion in his daily actions,
There might come a day when he would be reported by his subordinates. The Church of Storms has always been wary of those members who had been drifting out at sea for a long time, as prolonged acting as pirates might one day turn them into real pirates. In any case, the Lord of Storms has never given a revelation to exclude pirates from his followers. Under the cover of that blurred distortion, it's hard to see the details of one's clothing clearly.
This isn't a problem. However, I still have to pay attention in the future. During tarot gatherings, I should change into a set of ordinary clothes. Although I can't be sure, I still have to treat her as a pirate admiral. I can't afford to be careless. Alger thought cautiously.
At this moment, he heard the seemingly suppressed voice of the moon Emlyn, which was a result of him being unable to hide his emotions.
Mr. Hanged Man, I've done the preparations. When can you obtain the inheritance of that sanguine baron?
You mentioned before that it's in the hands of some powerful pirate?
You didn't have to say the last sentence. Alger's body instantly stiffened. Powerful pirate.
The hermit's eyes swept over the hanged man once again.
Alger's expression didn't change as he turned his head to the moon and asked, "Have you obtained the funds?"
Of course.
Emlyn raised his neck.
He originally wanted to wait until the 3-month maturity was up before he went to the bank to withdraw the money. But he soon discovered that he was in a completely different mood after deciding to buy the Sanguine Baron's inheritance. He no longer had any qualms or hesitation. He was filled with expectation and desire, wishing that he could get his hands on it immediately. It was just like how he felt in the past when he was about to buy a beloved doll. He had held back for more than a week before finally giving up by selling the acceptance draft. Although he had lost some money, it was still acceptable. In many situations, an acceptance draft could be used as a currency. I'll get it for you within the week. Finally, let's confirm the price. £4,500. Is that all right?
Seeing that a deal was about to be struck, Alger didn't pursue the moon's act of exposing him.
Emlyn thought about the dolls in his room, cleared his throat, and said with his eyes furtively darting around,
"Can it be cheaper? It's not up to me to decide, but I can try to acquire it for you at a lower price. Also, don't forget my commission. Let's lower it. How about £300? Alger's tone didn't change at all. All right. Emlyn exhaled quietly. Not a very powerful vampire, an underaged or a recently matured one. Katlia silently watched from the sidelines and made her judgment.
Seeing that the deal between Mr. Hanged Man and Mr. Moon had been concluded in a few sentences, Audrey habitually felt that she should buy something.
In a week or two, I'll contact the members of the Psychology Alchemists in Eastchester County and tell them that I've become a Psychology Alchemists member. I'll exchange my contribution points for the subsequent potion formula. There's no need to make a request to purchase it here for the time being. Once I find out what ingredients are needed, I can ask for everyone's help. There's no need to buy any mystical items for now. I've already had one of them reimbursed. Being able to obtain such rare items with too great a frequency might imply many problems. Audrey's thoughts raced, and she came up with an idea.
She turned halfway and looked at the gloomy man at the end of the table.
Mr. World, you mentioned that you have clues to the characteristic left behind by a psychiatrist. Have you successfully acquired it? I plan on buying it for Susie. She silently added in her heart.
In fact, when she was considering this matter, she had another slightly mischievous idea, which was to find an excuse for Mr. Fool to turn over the Dark Emperor card which sat beside him.
From her point of view, Ma'am Hermit was particularly affected by the matter regarding Roselle's diary.
And from how her reaction was extraordinarily excessive before she quickly hid it, it was quite possible that she knew about the cards of blasphemy. Therefore, the moment she saw it, she would expose a lot of problems and express the truest thoughts in her heart.
But she dismissed the idea in the end, not because she thought it would be bad to sound out Ma'am Hermit, but that this was a way of showing responsibility to both herself and the Tarot Club, and that she shouldn't make decisions for Mr. Fool.
If he wanted Ma'am Hermit to recognize the card of blasphemy, he definitely would have flipped it open himself.
If he didn't want to do so, then any attempts would be against his will. Audrey nodded solemnly but almost imperceptibly. At this moment, the world replied hoarsely, "If you're certain that you want it, then I will give it to you as soon as possible. The price is £1,800. Normally, it would be more appropriate to charge £1,200 to £1,500 for a psychiatrist's beyonder characteristic. But Klein had raised the premium slightly to see how much Miss Justice could pay. All right, Audrey agreed with a light tone. She had paid off the money owed to Viscount Glaint. She had received many gifts for having reached adulthood after returning to her family's fief.
It was a time when her finances were in a rather good condition.
She had even arranged for the money to be returned to Mr. Fool's Blessed next month. In the future, her monthly income would be above £3,000, and a substantial portion of her normal expenses wasn't going to be borne by her, due to the love of her parents and the results of her previous meritorious exploits. While the two were discussing, the hanged man was somewhat surprised. The world had just sold the faceless Beyonder characteristic the previous time, and he had recently acquired Steel Mavadi's Beyonder characteristic.
Yet, he appeared to have a psychiatrist characteristic in his collection, and all of this happened in less than a month.
On second thought, Alger quickly came to an understanding. The world represented a group of blessed of Mr. Fool. That might be the harvest from the other blessed. As he imagined this, the world, who was Klein, was in a state of shock towards Miss Justice's opulence. He had thought that Miss Justice, who had just spent £5,500 on a mystical item, wouldn't be as well off as before. It was just like last year, so he had reserved space for her to haggle. Who knew that she would still agree to the deal without hesitation? Has she dug up a gold mine? Klein couldn't help but silently lampoon.
Seeing that they had finished their discussion, Derek hurriedly raised his hand, having learned from Miss Justice.
Which one of you has the fruit of the Radiant Spirit Pack tree? He had rather successfully collected the other ingredients of the Solar High Priest potion. Just as Katlia had initially figured out that Miss Justice was a yet-to-advance psychiatrist, she heard this request. After a few seconds of silence she said, I do. What can you provide in exchange? After observing for a long time, she decided to intervene in a small transaction to gain a deeper understanding of how the Tarot Club operated. I can use the history of the City of Silver or the history of dragons, elves, and other dark creatures to barter, Derek said sincerely. Ma'am Hermit, this is a list of commonly seen monsters around the City of Silver. You can choose any ingredients you need from it. How honest. Klein almost looked up at the dome of the magnificent palace. What is he talking about? Katlia frowned slightly, momentarily failing to understand a single word from the sun. Chapter 569. A straw will show which way the wind blows. After a brief moment of consideration, the hermit Katlia made the choice that benefited her the most. She said without betraying her emotions, I'll make a decision after seeing what the commonly seen monsters are around the City of Silver. Another person who gains something without risking anything of her own. Are the people who spend too much time at sea good at fleecing others? Or is little son in such a state that makes it impossible to resist fleecing him? Klein instinctively excluded himself from the group of seafarers. All right. Under Justice and Company's scrutiny, Derek didn't hesitate to agree to Ma'am Hermit's request. He recalled the content and conjured it, recording the most commonly seen monsters around the City of Silver into a list. However, it wasn't as detailed as before, and there were quite a few missing. After all, the Sun Pathway's improvement in regards to his memory was rather limited. A few days had passed. Katlia received the piece of information and read through it in a serious manner. The more she scanned through it, the more alarmed she became. This was because the types of monsters had far exceeded her expectations by nearly 100 times. Most of the names used were ancient names.
If not for her being a Moses Ascetic Order member who had been pursued by knowledge, and having reached Sequence 5, making her experienced and knowledgeable, there was no way she could have known what these names would really be referring to.
But even so, there were still a few monsters she had never heard of. They were like shadows who would never reveal themselves in dreams or imaginations, forever lurking in the depths of the darkness. Where exactly is the City of Silver? Why are there so many monsters? 10 seconds later, Katlia raised her head without a change in expression. She said with a staid tone, Use the history of your City of Silver in exchange. All right. Derek's eyes lit up as he seemed to see hope in advancing.
He soon conjured the historical materials of the City of Silver with the help of Mr. Fool.
Having had ample experience, he knew that even more complete and detailed information was worth more than the fruit of a Radiant Spirit Pack tree. Hence, he retained some of what he knew. Katlia knew that she wasn't Mr. Fool, so it was impossible for her to let the members patiently wait for her to finish reading. Therefore, she casually flipped through it. After confirming its value, she deliberated and asked, How should I hand over the fruit of the Radiant Spirit Pack tree to you? Just as she said that, she suddenly thought of something. With a guess, she looked to the end of the long bronze table. Mr. Fool, is it done by a sacrificial ritual?
This left Audrey, who had prepared the answer, to be clearly stunned. She swallowed the words that she was about to say. Ma'am Hermit is very impressive and knowledgeable. She directly guessed that it's done via sacrificial and bestowment ritual. Audrey controlled her minute facial expressions as she clicked her tongue and sighed inwardly. Yes. Klein gently nodded without going into detail. He believed that it was impossible for a pirate admiral, a Sequence 5 powerhouse of the mystery prior pathway, to not know how a sacrifice was made. This was even something they were good at. Furthermore, she knew the fool's honorific name, so she didn't lack any of the necessary conditions. Indeed, with a godlike existence bearing witness to a gathering, a sacrificial and bestowment method is the safest and most convenient way of trading. And a conversation through the soul body can result in direct knowledge transfer. Katlia thanked him before saying to the sun, I'll do it as soon as possible. Although she didn't show any abnormalities, her heart was in no way calm. From her casual flipping of the information provided by the sun, she discovered that the City of Silver was truly filled with oddities. It included matters about being forsaken by the Lord, how it didn't have a sun, resulting in a state of eternal darkness and high and low-frequency lightning. Matters like how strange and terrifying monsters hid in the darkness when there was no light, and how they survived thanks to black-faced grass. It mentioned that they had survived for more than 2,000 years since the Dark Ages. All of this exceeded Katlia's expectations. As a powerhouse at sea who was knowledgeable and had acquired many secrets, she instantly connected the time and descriptions to a famous concept in history, the cataclysm. Following that, she followed this line of thought and made a further inference. The forsaken land of the gods. Suddenly, the figure she looked up to surfaced in Katlia's mind once again. A sentence filled with an emotive sigh surfaced. He had always been searching for the forsaken land of the gods back when he was alive. He said that the ultimate answer towards everything is hidden there. The sun comes from the forsaken land of the gods which Emperor Roselle couldn't find despite all his efforts? Mr. Fool can connect to that place directly? No, perhaps. He awoke from that place. Katlia thought in alarm and solemnity. She had previously belittled the Tarot Club because the moon, justice, and the sun were of low sequences. She believed that with Mr. Fool having awoken only recently, he was obviously unable to pull members of significant strength. However, she now had to re-evaluate matters. It involves the forsaken land of the gods, the Church of Storms, the Church of Mother Earth, the lone aristocrats. Perhaps, it's precisely because they're low sequences that these members can be nurtured to be able to reach higher ranks in their respective circles without being suspected. This will allow them to play a more important role. As for me, is it because of the Moses ascetic order or Her Majesty? Katlia seriously analyzed the motives of Mr. Fool. At this moment, the transactions were nearly coming to an end. The moon, the sun, and justice had all confirmed their respective transactions. As for the hermit Katlia, she was still observing. Out of caution, she didn't rashly open her mouth to expose more information about herself. Alger had originally planned on making a request to buy the Sequence 5 Ocean Songster's potion formula so that he could make the subsequent preparations, but with the addition of the hermit, he became especially wary. He gave up on his decision at the last minute and prepared to push it back until he had really advanced to Wind-Blessed. Only with him being stronger would he have the room to breathe. As Furs would be able to obtain the astrologer potion formula and a certain amount of ingredients from her teacher soon, she hadn't prioritized her purchases yet, so all she did was watch silently. She actually curbed her desire to buy a mystical item to make up for her relatively showy trickmaster powers that were lacking in strength, as well as how her apprentice powers were only good for passing through walls and opening doors. However, her real-life circumstances restricted her desires. Up to this day, her savings had exceeded £400. For a member of the middle class, that was rather good. But she clearly remembered how Miss Justice had bought a mystical item for £5,500 previously. Even if it was a relatively average mystical item without significant negative side effects, it will still require £1,000 to £2,000. Furs languidly sat there, unable to open her mouth to make a purchase. Klein controlled the world to scan his surroundings before hoarsely saying, I need a pair of eyes from a six-winged gargoyle. The supplementary ingredients of a nimble right master, Drago bark and the spring water from Sonia Island's Golden Spring, were commonly seen items in the mysterious world. As long as he purchased them at different occasions, he wouldn't garner suspicion from anyone. Therefore, Klein only requested for the eyes of a six-winged gargoyle. The hermit glanced at the world and said without rushing, £300, or the equivalent cost in gold coins. She had noticed that the previous transactions were all made in Loan's gold pound.
As expected of the Admiral of Stars who has a pirate crew with an ancient faction backing her. She is very resourceful, and her prices are cheaper than usual.
If not for little son's imminent advancement, and how he would soon obtain the method for removing the mental corruption of a beyond a characteristic, I would have even consulted her on this problem.
Klein thought as he made the world smile deeply. Okay.
With the transaction completed, the palace that resembled a giant's residence fell silent for more than 10 seconds.
Without Mr. Fool's reminder, Justice, the Sun, and company knew that they had entered the free exchange segment. The hanged man Alger deliberately looked at Miss Justice and Miss Magician without looking at Ma'am Hermit. Something major recently happened in the Rorstad archipelago. He didn't plan on divulging the world's involvement since it was very likely that Mr. Fool was in possession of the sea god's identity. If he were to rashly confirm this matter, it might spoil Mr. Fool's plans and throw himself into danger. He planned on using a normal tone to mention the happenings on the surface while emphasizing the Moses Ascetic Order member, archaeologist and adventurer, Letitia. He planned on using this to sound out the hermit to figure out if she was Admiral of Stars, Katlia.
This was because this pirate admiral was rumored to also be a member of the Moses Ascetic Order.
What happened? Justice asked with piqued interest.
Alger said calmly, a disguised archaeologist, Letitia, discovered an ancient elvish ruin in Simeem Island and took out an item from it. This pushed the deity the locals believed in, sea god Calvetua, to be on the brink of collapse. This fake god wished to create tsunamis to drown the island so that everyone could accompany it in its death, but it was stopped by the Church of Storm's Sea King.
Finally, Letitia was found and Calvetua had died.
The threat of the tsunamis was leveled, but strangely, the devout believers of the sea god would still occasionally receive responses.
Letitia is dead? For an ancient elvish ruin.
Katlia had heard of this archaeologist, who was part of the same organization, before, but she wasn't too familiar with her. This was because formal members of the Moses Ascetic Order had to spend a certain amount of time in silent ascetic training. When fully paying attention, she was able to control her powers in a way that significantly exceeded the average person. Therefore, she only seemed slightly stirred as she listened seriously to the hanged man's description without showing any obvious abnormalities. When the hanged man said that Calvetua was dead and how the sea god still responded to its believers, Katlia first frowned in puzzlement before using her spiritual intuition to recall a certain scene. Yesterday, she had seen Mr. Fool hold a milky white scepter when he pulled her above the gray fog. At the tip of the scepter were many tiny blue gems, which were swirling with countless points of holy light. And more importantly, it emanated an aura of godhood, one that seemed like the corporeal aura of the ocean and storm.
This.
Katlia instinctively turned her head to the end of the long bronze table, where Mr. Fool was shrouded in the grayish-white fog.
Chapter 570. Not admitting or denying Why is she looking at Mr. Fool? Audrey sharply noticed the hermit's subtle motion. This left her somewhat suspicious. From her point of view, this was an atypical response. Mr. Hanged Man was clearly mentioning something that had little to do with everyone.
He was talking about the so-called sea god Calvetua's ability to occasionally reply to its believers despite its apparent death. So why would Ma'am Hermit look towards Mr. Fool?
Calvetua's death. Occasionally replying to its believers. Ma'am Hermit is looking at Mr. Fool. Could it be?
Audrey's eyes lit up as she came to a conclusion. Could it be that Mr. Fool is the one replying to Calvetua's believers?
Ma'am Hermit knows about this, so?
As thoughts whizzed through her mind, Audrey had turned her body halfway to look expectantly at Mr. Fool, who was seated leisurely at the end of the long bronze table.
Meanwhile, Alger was also surprised and alarmed about the hermit's unexpected reaction.
I was only trying to sound her out about what connection she has with the Moses Ascetic Order member, Letitia. Why would she suddenly turn to look at Mr. Fool? Could it be that she knows that the current sea god is a manifestation of Mr. Fool?
Her reaction implies this is highly likely.
Before she was recruited into the Tarot Club, did she have a lot of secret exchanges with Mr. Fool, and was already secretly working for him? The more Alger thought, the more he paid attention to the hermit. Then, he subconsciously joined her in looking towards Mr. Fool, who was shrouded in the grayish-white fog. He, the hermit, and Justice turned around at different times, but their nearly unanimous actions made the magician Furs and company notice something amiss.
Why are they looking at Mr. Fool?
Does sea god Calvetua's death have to do with Mr. Fool? Believing they were smart, Furs and Emlyn began guessing at the reason as they cast their gaze to the end of the long bronze table. Derek didn't know who sea god Calvetua was,
nor did he understand what it meant for it to respond to its believers even after its death. However, since everyone was looking at Mr. Fool, he naturally looked over as well. The world was late by a second, as though he was deliberating over something. He first scanned the hanged man, making him shudder in fear. Then, he changed the direction of his gaze.
At this point, Klein had already come to realize which detail Ma'am Hermit had used to guess that he was the one replying to see God Calvetua's believers in its stead.
He was still stumped over what stance to use. Should I pretend that it's a trivial matter and that I didn't take it to heart, but since you mentioned it, I'll just admit it in passing? Or should I take the stance that since I'm a god, there's no need for me to explain myself to you, so there's no need for me to admit or deny anything? Klein recalled the fool's persona and quickly made a decision.
The choice was to neither admit or deny anything, so as to prevent him from losing his standing as a god. However, he would add a single sentence on a particular point, making those who had failed to guess it become more puzzled, while the suspicious ones would be enlightened but would still be left shrouded in confusion as they realized, deep down, how unfathomable Mr. Fool was.
With this in mind, Klein, who had leaned back, chuckled. He said leisurely and indifferently, Calvetua became a demigod by relying on a relic left behind by Calamity Kohinum. So they're consulting Mr. Fool about the situation with the sea god. But that doesn't convince me. It feels like there's a deeper truth hidden behind this matter. Could it be? No way, right? Furs frowned as she began coming up with all sorts of thoughts. As expected, Katlia believed Mr. Fool was giving a straightforward answer while also informing them of some secrets. That demigod scepter is Calvetua's characteristic or Calamity Kohinum's relic, or is it something that covers both definitions? Who is Calamity Kohinum? The name sounds elvish. Yes, the hanged man mentioned that Letitia found an ancient elven ruin. It's the residence of a high elf? How did Mr. Fool get that scepter? Did he rely on the hanged man or someone else? No, it doesn't seem like the hanged man. Otherwise, he wouldn't have proactively mentioned this matter. What motive does Mr. Fool have behind responding to the sea god's believers? Is this required for his awakening, something that can truly affect reality? The more Katlia thought, the more she found Mr. Fool unfathomable. It was just like how his body was being concealed by the thick gray fog. The clearer she could see him, the more puzzled, horrified, and apprehensive she became. This might be a tussle between gods. Katlia sighed inwardly as the emotions got the better of her. I guessed right. Alger finally verified that the present sea god was a manifestation of the fool. His worries and indecision from before were instantly rewarded. On certain occasions, as a fake sea god believer, I can openly pray. I wonder how much Mr. Fool has recovered. How much of his power can he release from the seal? It's at least at the demigod level. He will be able to provide tremendous protection at sea. The hermit's unsurprised reaction implies that she had long interacted with Mr. Fool and had learned of certain things ahead of time. This implies that her sequence isn't low. She might really be a powerhouse at the pirate admiral level. This is both good and bad news for me. The good news is that I have an additional powerful faction at sea supporting me. At times, we can tacitly cooperate and complete matters that were previously deemed unimaginable. The bad news is that a lot of my news and resource channels will be overshadowed by hers. My purpose in the Tarot Club will drastically decline. Of course, that's under the premise that she really is Admiral of Stars. Yes, I have to adjust my focus from gathering news and resources and align it towards the church. This is something she can't supplant me, Alger thought with joy and wariness. That sea god is really Mr. Fool. No. It should be said that the present sea god is Mr. Fool's manifestation. He has truly begun interfering with the real world? This is great. In the future, I can pray to sea god directly and receive a response when I'm out traveling at sea? Audrey felt surprised, overjoyed, and proud. According to what she knew, the churches didn't do fixed ritualistic magic internally. The ones who received responses by solely praying to the deities were mainly priests or a chance occurrence. Otherwise, they were blessed who just numbered at a handful. As for receiving a response from every prayer, they would be an extreme exception, even among blessed. But I can. Mr. Fool is returning to his throne, one step at a time. Replacing sea god is one of those steps. Audrey didn't hide the changes in her emotions as she smiled, sitting straight and elegantly. Kohinum? That's an elf's name. I think I've heard someone mention it before. Emlyn attempted to recall, but it was in vain.
As for Calvetua's death and how the sea god still replied to its believers, as well as the reason why the hermit Justice, the hanged man, had looked towards Mr. Fool, he had made a slight guess without thinking too deeply about the matter.
What has this got to do with me?
It doesn't affect my saving of the sanguine, nor is it anything of interest.
Anyway, I can just pray to Mr. Fool if there are any problems.
Emlyn mumbled to himself, showing disdain towards the emotional changes the others had.
Calamity? Queen of Calamity?
But there are no records that say that her name is Kohainum. Derek turned his head to the left very slightly, a common tick he did when he recalled things. From the looks of it, Little Son isn't sure if Kohainum is the Queen of Calamity. Otherwise, he wouldn't have such a reaction. Klein retracted his gaze in disappointment. He controlled the world to cough, pulling everyone back from their thoughts. Following that, the world conjured a picture with the Fool's help. He showed it to both sides of the table and asked, "Does anyone know her?"
It was a picture of the red-haired Helene.
Klein mainly wanted to know if Admiral of Stars Katlia or the hanged man Alger knew her. After all, they were well-informed people out at sea. Alger glanced at it, and just as he was about to say that he didn't know her, he heard Ma'am Hermit say with a deep voice, "Red-haired Helene. She's from a fallen noble family, and has the bloodline from the Intis's Sauron family." Katlia paused before adding, "She was once a trader out at sea, but she was later said to have been abducted by ailment maiden Tracy."
Abducted by ailment maiden Tracy.
I thought it would be some contrived story about a domineering pirate and a noble lady. However, Tracy can be considered a domineering pirate.
Heh.
Klein instantly made some connections. Furs was still lost in her thoughts over the connection between Sea God and the Fool when she suddenly snapped to her senses. She acutely noticed that great opportunities lay in red-haired Helene and Vice Admiral Ailment's story as she began to daydream. To her regret, Ma'am Hermit had only said a few sentences without continuing. The Hermit knows Vice Admiral Ailment. However, that doesn't imply anything. Beyonders of a certain sequence or knowledgeable people will know who the 7 pirate admirals are. Their bounty posters are everywhere. The Hermit is rather aware of matters over at Intis. This is something that can be determined for now. The hanged man wasn't interested in red-haired Helene, only the Hermit's real identity. With red-haired Helene's matter coming to a close, Audrey began considering if she should consult the others about the Mind Dragon. Unlike before, there was now the addition of Ma'am Hermit, who was of unknown character and dubious allegiances. This left her hesitant. After a brief deliberation, she said, "I recently sought out the traces of a Mind Dragon and went to a place which has the tradition of worshipping dragons." She had concealed the exact location as the details might implicate her. Chapter 571. Huge Pressure. Audrey simply mentioned the ancient folk song, but she didn't describe the content in detail. She was afraid that the knowledgeable Ma'am Hermit would be able to guess at the exact location. She only mentioned the inspiration she had, and how she used a psychological cue to retain her lucidity in her dream before beginning a magical journey.
Psychological cue? She knows how to plant a psychological cue?
She's likely a Sequence 7 psychiatrist. Katlia habitually made a judgment, but she immediately felt even more perplexed. Then why would she be buying the beyonder characteristic of a psychiatrist? Taking the same potion gives a limited increase in strength while being prone to losing control. Furthermore, it will be an obstacle towards the digestion of the potion.
To create a mystical item?
But this will overlap with her own beyonder powers. There's no value to that.
To give it to someone else?
Amidst Katlia's guesses, Audrey had already mentioned her chaotic dream and how she came to the edge of her conscious. Then, she used the conjuring method she learned from Mr. Fool to create a staircase that led downwards. She then slowly delved deep into her conscious. She didn't describe in detail the various points of light in her subconscious, as it involved embarrassing secrets she didn't wish to share. She focused on her lonely and long journey with no end in sight. She also expressed how there were various monsters hiding in the surrounding grayness that placed immense pressure on her. She mentioned how she nearly broke down several times and barely managed to endure it thanks to her beyonder powers. Then, she reached the point of her finally arriving at the illusory sea of collective subconscious. The memory imprints of the human pioneers and the spread and reflection of the consciousness of the surrounding creatures were presented under Audrey's coherent and unhurried descriptions. Then, it was fixed onto the dragon with grayish stone scales that had flown out from the sea of collective subconscious. There's a dragon that lives in the sea of collective subconscious? What a magical and beautiful journey!
Although Miss Justice didn't encounter any enemies or danger, it still leaves me a little surreal. Fur suddenly thought of a title of a book, Miss Justice's Dream Tour. While rounding things up, Audrey scanned the area and asked, "Ladies and gentlemen, do you have any suggestions? Do you think that the Dragon City of Miracles, Live Seed, is also hidden in the sea of collective subconscious? If I wish to continue searching, what should I take note of? What advanced preparations do I need to make?"
The hanged man Alger glanced at the hermit and said in a serious tone, "I don't think you should continue exploring.
It's a very dangerous act. According to the records, most dragons are creatures with flesh and blood. This includes the mind dragon.
By allowing itself to survive and swim through the so-called sea of collective subconscious, it means that the dragon you saw was a sufficiently high sequence.
At the very least, it's at the level of a demigod. Before you reach sequence 5, it's best that you don't consider this."
Katlia nodded and said, "There are many other dangerous things in the sea of collective subconscious. The accumulated maleficent thoughts of humanity, the desires that can corrupt soul bodies, the terrifying memories since ancient times that resemble storms and waves at sea. All of these will deal severe psychological harm to you.
It might prevent you from ever waking up. Besides, that's the sea of collective subconscious of all creatures, which isn't only limited to humans. There might be evil spirits, evil gods, or the consciousness of some terrifying existence hidden in there. They're like gigantic maelstrom that can devour ships. Before you truly acquire beyonder powers that allow you to travel through the sea of collective subconscious, it's best not to rashly explore too deeply."
Audrey, who was filled with expectations, felt disappointed. However, she couldn't help but admit that Mr. Hanged Man and Ma'am Hermit had spoken very logically and sincerely. She silently inhaled and said to herself, "Audrey, don't be headstrong. Wait till you're sequence 5 before making the attempt again." She totally didn't consider how difficult it was to become a sequence 5. At that level, one could even compete to become one of the 7 pirate admirals, or even make the 7 become 8. From Audrey's point of view, with Mr. Fool and the Tarot Club, as long as she was careful and calm, she would definitely be able to successfully attain that level in a year or 2 if she didn't take unnecessary risks. Only the gate to being a demigod was hard to push open. Ma'am Hermit knows a lot and is very knowledgeable. Audrey clung onto the last sliver of hope and looked towards Mr. Fool at the end of the table, hoping that this godlike existence would provide a suggestion that was different from Mr. Hanged Man or Ma'am Hermit.
"Don't look at me. I have no idea." Klein tried his best not to blink.
His understanding of the conscious, subconscious, and the collective subconscious was still stuck at a theoretical level that Spirit Medium Daily had described.
He didn't understand anything more. Despite having his dreams intruded frequently, he had never thought of exploring the world outside the dream despite retaining his lucidity. Therefore, how was he to provide any suggestions to Miss Justice? In fact, he had a natural idea regarding this. However, he wasn't sure if it would work without having done any verification.
In the past, even if he lacked the confidence, he could vaguely make a comment, but now, with Admiral of Stars Katlia sitting at the side, watching, it only made it easier for him to make mistakes the more he spoke.
The less he spoke, the fewer mistakes he would commit. And there was no chance of making mistakes by keeping silent. What a pressure-inducing new member. Klein sighed inwardly.
He didn't say a word and maintained his faint smile. If not for him being above the grey fog and how he existed in the form of a spirit body, he suspected that such highly difficult acting would make the muscles around his eyes spasm.
Mr. Fool doesn't have any suggestions. Audrey retracted her gaze in depression.
She stopped fantasizing about exploring the sea of collective subconscious so soon.
At this moment, the Moon Emlyn, who was already turning impatient, cleared his throat. "I've seriously researched the history handed down by us Sanguine. Sanguine, he really is a vampire. Nurturing vampires and pulling vampires into the church is really a tradition of the Church of Mother Earth." Katlia nodded as she looked like she was listening seriously. Meanwhile, she felt that some of her conclusions needed adjustments. The moon directly expressed his identity. Does this mean that Mr. Fool has a potent deterrence, even in the outside world, that the members aren't afraid of information being leaked? It seems like I don't have to completely hide my circumstances. Emlyn paused and looked at the sun before tipping his chin. Before the cataclysm, there was no city of silver, only the kingdom of silver.
If it were anyone else who had thrown such doubt on him, Derek would have hastened to retort, expressing the fact that the people of the City of Silver were descendants of the Kingdom of Silver and that he hadn't lied. However, after glancing at Mr. Moon and sensing his smugness, Derek turned his head to the side, feeling that an explanation was beneath him.
Why must I let an arrogant vampire who doesn't acknowledge the City of Silver's history believe me? He thought silently to himself.
From his reaction, Emlyn could tell that the City of Silver was indeed related to the Kingdom of Silver. He'd scared and said, the faith of the Kingdom of Silver wasn't originally Giant King Ormer, but his queen, Omabella.
Omabella?
Derek turned his head and blurted out. Our City of Silver has no records of this matter, nor are there any records of a queen named Omabella.
Emlyn chuckled and spread out his hands. That's why, there's nothing wrong with me saying that your City of Silver's history is flawed and incomplete, right? Clearly, there are mistakes in your records of sanguine history. You took such a roundabout way to prove this. Should I say that a vampire like you has clear logic, or that you're someone who bears grudges? Klein held back his laughter and stopped himself from sizing up Emlyn White. The moon and the sun's debate benefited him greatly, allowing him to know that the giant queen, the goddess of harvest, was named Omabella. The sun Derek was just about to give a retort to Mr. Moon when he heard Ma'am Hermit speak. Omabella is the goddess of harvest from the second epoch. She's also the queen of the giant king's court. Legend has it that she perished at the end of the second epoch, but it's impossible to verify since no one has seen her corpse or relics. The goddess of harvest is really named Omabella. Derek was stunned.
He wished to retort, but he was unable to say a word as this matter proved that the history of the City of Silver had several holes.
He instantly felt somewhat aggrieved. When Emlyn saw this, he felt good. Pleasure rose from the depths of his heart. After another round of exchanges, the tarot gathering came to an end. Klein smiled and said, "Everyone, we shall meet next week."
"By your will."
Audrey immediately got up to bow. The others weren't any slower, including the hermit Catlia. Upon returning to reality, Admiral of Stars Catlia looked at the shattered celestial globe on her desk. She then seriously recalled what had happened at the gathering.
A few details made her believe that the Tarot Club involved itself in many matters that made it nothing to scoff at.
And hidden deep in the grey fog was Mr. Fool. Like the world, who was hidden behind thick shadows. He was unreadable and unfathomable. It was unknown what he was planning.
After more than 10 seconds of silence, Catlia retrieved a pen and some paper and wrote while deliberating. Someone has been deliberately collecting the Emperor's diary pages.
She didn't dare to expose any information that involved the Tarot Club, as she was afraid of being punished by Mr. Fool. All she could do was give a heads up on things that could be discovered under ordinary circumstances. After she was done writing and folding the letter, she took out a golden exquisite harmonica she carried with her. Putting it to her lips, she blew it.
In the blink of an eye, she saw the letter strangely vanish.
Even though she wasn't wearing her glasses, she was unable to discover the arrival of the messenger. Phew. Catlia sighed and reached for her forehead and said silently, "The pressure is really huge when participating in a gathering while under the supervision of a god. With Admiral of Stars joining, the pressure on me as the Fool has greatly increased." Klein rubbed his temples above the grey fog and directly returned to the real world. He wanted to attempt the inspiration Miss Justice had received from exploring her dreams. Chapter 572. Recite my name. After a series of chores, Klein opened his locked bedroom door and looked into the living room. He saw Danet sleeping soundly on a reclining chair. Although he had long heard it, Klein couldn't help but lampoon. It's not even 4 in the afternoon. Has this guy completely let his hair down now that he doesn't need to monitor the radio transceiver? With a thought, he gradually smiled, feeling that this was exactly what he needed. The premise of him maintaining his lucidity in dreams had involved someone invading his consciousness. Typically, his dreams were a turbid mess, which meant that he alone wasn't able to complete the experiment. After all, he couldn't plant a psychological cue on himself. Therefore, he planned on using external forces to enter the dreams of others. This way, he could maintain his lucidity like a nightmare. He originally planned on heading out to find a suitable target, but Danet's posture was in such a perfect state that he could hardly stop himself from kicking him. No, I should be experimenting. Klein corrected his thoughts. He contemplated for a moment and didn't use a dream charm. As a Sequence 7 pyromaniac, with the ancient name being Fire Mage, Danet's spiritual perception wasn't to be written off. Once he softly chanted an incantation that could stir the powers of nature, Danet's would definitely be awoken. As such, it would be a question of whether he could evade the matter in a timely fashion. After some deliberation, Klein took out another thing he had prepared. It was a gem-like object that seemed dark and deep. It was the beyonder characteristic left behind by a nightmare. It could be used to a certain extent, just like Nimblewright Master Rosego's all-black eye. However, the effects were inferior to one that was from a mystical item. For example, this nightmare beyonder characteristic didn't allow Klein to pass through the dreams of someone across the city from his inn suite, nor was he able to forcefully pull people into a dream. However, it was still simple enough to perform the most basic form of intruding into someone's dream at a close distance. Klein held the dark gem and spread out his spirituality. The illusory darkness rapidly spread before his eyes, filling his vision. Everything before his eyes were blanketed over, including Danitz. There was no longer a humanoid figure but an ellipsoidal blob of light. Klein immediately extended his spirituality out and made contact with it. Without any warning, various scenes flooded his surroundings as they flashed rapidly. Finally, it came to stop on a ship that was dozens of meters long. It had a smoke-churning chimney and large sails that were fully raised. The deck was polished abnormally bright, shimmering with the glimmer of a gold coin when sunlight hit it. Danitz stood under the main cannon as he had his arms crossed. He was leisurely rushing the sailors, shouting from time to time, "Scrub that area again. Dogs hit. Do you wish to copy down the ancient Faesac dictionary? This fellow is quite impressive on the Golden Dream." Klein ignored the owner of the dream and flew to the other end of the ship. He found a hidden spot and landed on the deck before preparing to test his spiritual perception. What he planned on experimenting on was simple. He wanted to know if chanting the fool's honorific name in a dream was effective. He wanted to know if he could sense someone praying. This way, if Miss Justice encounters danger in the sea of collective subconscious, she can use this method to seek help. After stretching his back, Klein's expression gradually turned solemn as he softly said, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the gray fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck." With the words in Hermes being spoken, he very quickly finished reciting the fool's honorific name. However, Klein didn't hear the series of illusory pleas. "It doesn't work?" Klein frowned in thought. He analyzed whether it was really impossible, or if he had made a mistake somewhere. Yes, chanting in the dream doesn't actually produce any noise. Relying on Hermes alone isn't sufficient. To achieve the effects of praying, I'll have to use a language like ancient Hermes that can stir the powers of nature. This is the same state as me copying the account password of my anonymous account. Klein nodded slightly and began to chant his honorific name in ancient Hermes. He wasn't afraid that there would be an accident, but that his stirring of the powers of nature would wake blazing Danitz from his sleep. He recited each word, quickly finishing the 3 sentences. Following that, Klein heard the stacked series of irritable and illusory pleas. At that moment, Danitz's dream quivered as the golden dream quickly disintegrated. Klein didn't stay any longer and immediately left. He returned back to his bedroom before Danitz woke up. After 7 to 8 seconds, Danitz sat up in a daze as he muttered to himself in fear, "Why did I dream of that madman Gairman Sparrow causing trouble on the Golden Dream? What a terrifying matter. Dogs hit. It must be the result of me worrying over this matter all this time." Inside the bedroom, Klein had already taken 4 steps counterclockwise and gone above the gray fog. Without any surprises, he saw a rippling light by the fool's high-back chair. In it was the scene of him in the dream. It really works. One can still receive a response when chanting the fool's honorific name in languages such as ancient Hermes or Jotun. It's no wonder some people might suddenly die in their sleep despite not doing a thing. They might be reading some materials or had memorized certain symbols in the day and accidentally replicated them in the dream. The danger in this world really cannot be prevented. Klein dispelled the rippling light and considered if he should inform Miss Justice of the results of the experiment. To only inform her later instead of saying it on the spot is a little damaging to the fool's image. But Miss Justice is the kind of girl with a huge sense of curiosity. Although she has been warned by Mr. Hanged Man and Admiral of Stars, and even if she's a little more mature now, there's still the chance of her taking risks. Of course, if anything were to happen, it's on herself and it has nothing to do with me. Klein couldn't help but recall Miss Justice's adoration of the fool and the thought of her optimism and cheerfulness that brought him happiness, as well as her contributions towards the Tarot Club all this time. Finally, he sighed and said in a self-deprecating manner, "I still need to inform her and give a warning. This is the treatment a VIP gets." After making the decision, Klein didn't hesitate to spread out his spirituality to touch the crimson star representing Miss Justice. In a room of the huge manor in East Chester County. Audrey had her legs leaning sideways as she sat before her dressing table. She was recalling the words Mr. Hanged Man and Ma'am Hermit had said. After being warned by 2 senior Beyonders, she suddenly realized something. It wasn't that the mid and upper echelons of the psychology alchemists wasn't aware that one could explore dreams, the icy mountain of the subconscious, and the sea of collective subconscious by using a self-induced psychological cue. The reason why they didn't tell me anything is because it's too dangerous for a psychiatrist. Many people have already died in such explorations. But they should warn me. Ah, right. From their point of view, I'm only a Sequence 8 telepathist. I'm not equipped with the powers of a psychological cue, so there was no need to warn me. Audrey finally understood the perplexing matter. Just as she was about to let Susie enter the room to calm the disappointment in her heart, she suddenly saw thick gray fog spew out, instantly flooding her vision. In the middle of the endless grayish-white, a figure sat in a high-backed chair. Looking down at her, it said, "Do not make attempts without careful consideration." Before Audrey realized what was happening, she heard the deep and majestic voice sound out again. "If you encounter dangers in your dreams, you can recite my name." Recite your name? Audrey's eyes widened as she became overjoyed. "Yes, Mr. Fool." Seeing that Miss Justice was excited instead of showing any doubts, Klein secretly heaved a sigh of relief and chuckled. "Use ancient Hermes." With that said, his figure faded away and the gray fog vanished. Audrey sat there stunned for 2 seconds before hurriedly pursing her lips, afraid that she wasn't on her best behavior. Mr. Fool actually specially warned me. He even permitted me to recite his name in my dream. Audrey excitedly took a few steps on the spot, believing that she had really become a blessed of God. Of course, she also remembered Mr. Fool's warning. She planned to understand more from the psychology alchemists and make another attempt only when she was sufficiently prepared. The corners of her mouth curled up slightly as she randomly tapped her chest, saying silently, "May Mr. Fool watch over me." Above the gray fog, Klein began to consider another matter. Red-haired Helene, who had a reward worth £1,000, was actually related to Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy. Tracy took over Kalangos's crew and changed his flagship to the Black Death. As for Kalangos, he previously plundered a tycoon named Jimmy Necker. That tycoon had previously obtained parts of Death's Chronicles. It came from a Balam royal family's mausoleum. This information came from that nightmare inside Creeping Hunger. It should benefit Mr. Azek to a certain extent. I can also investigate the matter in passing. Klein found another reason to look forward to finding red-haired Helene. He originally planned on using the magic mirror, a Rhodes, to find her. But now, he planned on mobilizing sea god believers to perform a search. In the past, it's quite demeaning to send a revelation for just £1,000. But now that it involves a pirate admiral, it can barely make people guess that there are secret motives behind it. Klein conjured red-haired Helene's photo and summoned the sea god scepter. He had never done a mass revelation, so it was possible that it would be a burden that he couldn't withstand. He chose higher-ups like Kalat and Edmonton. With waves reaching high into the sky as a background, he said in a deep voice, "Find her and protect her. Be careful of Tracy's forces." Klein didn't provide further explanations as he broke down this scene along with red-haired Helene's photo into many sets before projecting them into the corresponding dots of light. Chapter 573. Teaching a lesson in reality in a forest in Blue Mountain Island where the resistance base was located. Sitting in a wheelchair, Kalat raised his bald head and looked towards the sunlight that was scattering at the cave's entrance. His eyes couldn't hide his joy. He acutely sensed that ever since God reappeared over the land and stated his 10 commandments, the previous bloodshed and chaos had changed. From time to time, he would provide them with guidance which was filled with wisdom. Furthermore, he would observe all creatures and proactively interfere with the situation at sea in a bid to help the resistance and everyone in Rorsted, allowing them to pass through a difficult, thorny path while still being able to see some hope. Perhaps this is the true meaning behind his reappearance over the land. Kalat recalled the revelation he had just received, and guessed that the red-haired woman named Helene was like a fulcrum for Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy and the forces out at sea. She was the key to spoiling the balance between the countries, and only by making the world situation more chaotic would the people of Rorsted receive the opportunity of being liberated. Kalat drew in a breath and quickly set up a ritual to pray to sea god, conjuring Helene's picture. After doing all of this, he instinctively turned his head to the side and wore a somewhat mixed expression.
Living in that direction was the high priest of the Church of Sea God, a priest who was a high-ranking member of the resistance.
Although they don't dare go against the revelations and have made tremendous changes, in many ways, they're still immersed in the past. They're obstinate, conservative, backward, and savage. They refuse to embrace a more civilized church. If this goes on, they'll one day be abandoned by God. Kalat couldn't hide the smile in his heart while he felt a strong sense of anguish. After scanning through all the believers' prayers and picking a few to respond to, Klein returned to the real world. He planned on heading out to search for a chance to enact true acting. When his right hand gripped the door handle, a ridiculous but possible thought came to his mind. My true goal is not to find red-haired Helene, but to use this opportunity to get to Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy and figure out what happened to Tycoon Jimmy Necker, so as to get to know the location of the ancient chronicles of death. That is to say, I only need to lure Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy out with red-haired Helene. As for whether she's the real person or not, that doesn't matter. I can make myself red-haired Helene and let Danit send me to Strongman Ozeal, get the reward, and easily meet Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy. What an impressive sequence of actions. Klein suddenly shook his head as he found a reason to reject the idea. Although I'm a faceless, I can't accept wearing drag. Could it be that overcoming my inner resistance is also one of the principles for acting? Furthermore, I don't know red-haired Helene. Acting as her wouldn't work. I would just be like her on the surface, and I wouldn't be able to fool people who are familiar with her. That way, I won't be able to meet Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy. Yes, the person searching for red-haired Helene might not be Tracy, but an enemy of hers. I don't know Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy's background. Rashly doing such an act would result in immeasurable danger. It's best to be safe and abide by my wishes. I'll first search for red-haired Helene, and after determining the details, I can consider the subsequent actions. At that moment, Klein suddenly felt that something was amiss in the living room. Danit's snoring had softened, and the time between each snore shortened. Vice Admiral Iceberg is here? Klein turned the handle and opened the door to the bedroom. While making this silent action, Danit sat up with his eyes open. He tried hard to hide his smile as he said, "Captain came. She said that Admiral of Blood's crew was sighted at Longtail Island and is continuing south. His destination seems to be the Berserk Sea. The source of the news is trustworthy. Longtail Island? The island at the southern end of the Rorsted Sea? From the looks of it, Admiral of Blood previously planned on coming to Byam, but the fight between Calvetua and Sea King John Cotman scared him away. He circled around the area and headed straight for the Berserk Sea. Yes, it's probably because his intelligence officer, Old Quinn, didn't send a telegram to inform him." Klein felt pangs of regret and could only lament how reality changed faster than his plans. He had planned to make his hunt of Admiral of Blood become the crowning battle of the crazy adventurer and bounty hunter, Gehrman Sparrow. Killing a single steel Mavadi ultimately lacks that shock and awe effect. Klein didn't say a word as he calmly looked at Danitz. Danitz felt a little uneasy from the intense stare as he gave a hollow chuckle. "Admiral of Blood has fled. Your cooperation with Captain has come to an end, right? I can now return to the Golden Dream, right? Further developments can be done via your messenger." Klein pondered for a moment and took out a piece of paper from his pocket. He scribbled the method to summon his messenger. Following that, he flicked his wrist, sending the piece of paper out like a metallic plate. Danitz was a hunter at Sequence 9, so he easily reached out and caught the piece of paper. He scanned it before a scarlet flame rose in his palms, burning the paper to ashes. "Haha, even if I forget it, Captain will have a way of making me recall it." He paused and squeezed out a smile before asking again. "I can now return to the Golden Dream, right?" Klein nodded slightly and said yes. "I can." Danitz held back his urge to pump his fist in celebration, afraid that he would end up antagonizing the madman, Gehrman Sparrow. He smiled cautiously and said, "I'll first pay off the room for this period of time and buy a ship ticket. As you know, Byam hasn't been calm recently. Captain doesn't wish for the Golden Dream to dock at the harbor here. At least you know how to settle the room's payment." Klein didn't say a word as he maintained his austere attitude. He draped himself with a coat and took his hat before walking towards his luxurious suite. When his back disappeared into the corner of a staircase and vanished from Danitz's sight, Danitz shrank back into his room and clenched his fist, pumping them into the air. "Wonderful! Wonderful! I'm finally free!" He didn't delay in wearing his cap and heading to the front desk of the Wind of Azure Inn to settle the bill. He informed them that this didn't mean that he was checking out. Danitz quickly hit the streets and ran straight for a place known as the Seaweed Bar. He found the air fresh and invigorating. After he took a few steps, he suddenly noticed bounty posters pasted along the walls around a bend. Blazing Danitz, £5,500. The posters were just 2 steps away from Danitz. That familiar face allowed for a clear comparison with his cap-wearing face. Danitz clenched his teeth and revealed a sorrowful smile. He hurriedly pressed down his cap, nearly concealing his normal line of sight. But even so, he still felt uneasy. He went to a recent department store and bought a gray scarf. He wrapped it around his neck and hid his nose and mouth in it. At this point in time, Danitz relaxed somewhat as he sped up his pace and rushed for his destination. The Seaweed Bar was a place where gangs gathered. It was common for infamous pirates to appear there. Although this place wasn't like the Swordfish Bar or a Mirror's Leaf Bar that allowed access to a lot of information and resources, it had its own unique niche. It had many resourceful secret channels. What Danitz wanted to do was buy a scalp ticket to Galagos, as this wouldn't need him to provide any identification. He knew very well that be it in the past or present, his bounty poster would be plastered across all the ticket booths. He had bought the first-class tickets to the White Agate via the same method as well. After entering the bar, Danitz didn't take off his cap and scarf. He carefully surveyed the area and found Daniel, who sold scalped tickets. He didn't directly approach him and instead retracted his gaze from the thin and somewhat swarthy man who was in his 30s. He began searching for someone unfamiliar. After a round of choices, Danitz squeezed through the crowd and arrived beside a lad who was drinking at the bar counter. He tapped him on the shoulder and suppressed his voice. "Do me a favor." "What?" The lad turned his head warily and ended up seeing a suspicious man. The lower half of his face was covered in a gray scarf and the cap on his head nearly hid his eyes. He revealed almost nothing about his face. Such a dress-up simply meant that he was suspicious. This was because the Rorstad archipelago's lowest temperature during the winter was about 10 degrees Celsius. Danitz pointed at Daniel. "See that guy over there? Buy me a ticket for Galagos tomorrow." He handed over 3 one-pound notes and chuckled. "The rest is yours." Although a scalp ticket was much more expensive than a retail ticket, Galagos wasn't too far, making £3 more than sufficient. Of course, this was also because the journey was relatively shorter, and there was no need for him to buy a first-class ticket. The reason why Danitz didn't buy it himself was because he was worried that Daniel would recognize him, bringing him unwanted trouble. Back when his bounty was only £3,000, pirates and adventurers at his level or lower had to consider how many people were needed to take him down. The bounty received wasn't something that could make them forget about their fear towards Vice Admiral Iceberg and the risk of losing their lives. Hence, very few people would take the initiative to attack him. As such, his safety was pretty much guaranteed in such black markets. But now, his bounty reward had already reached £5,500. Even if several people joined forces, the amount of money each of them could get was a sizable sum. Furthermore, there were many people out at sea who were desperados. Apart from that, there would be people who found their own bounties too low and wished to prove their strength. These people would definitely challenge a target like Danitz, who was infamous but was of little risk. It was precisely because of this that Danitz was afraid that Daniel would betray him. Therefore, he hired a random person to buy it on his behalf. The lad held the cash and gave Danitz another look before getting up from his seat. He then walked towards Daniel. He deliberately slowed down his footsteps when he walked past some drunkards as he whispered to them. When Danitz saw this scene, he suddenly became guarded. He thought of a problem. With him acting suspiciously, it was very obvious that there was a problem with him. He was a perfect target for being betrayed. "Heh, do you think my reputation as blazing was bought?" Danitz planned on teaching the lad a lesson after he obtained the ticket. At this point, he discovered that a familiar figure had walked in. He was an infamous pirate, Blue Eyes Meath, with a bounty of £2,800. And this pirate clearly knew this group of people were planning to betray him. Blue Eyes Meath still has a few rather powerful subordinates. Danitz didn't hesitate to get up and head for the bar's back door. His speed increased as he agilely forced himself through the drunkards and escaped from the bar. Then, with his rich anti-tracking skills, he completely escaped from the group of people. Danitz didn't dare to stay on the streets since it was already dark. The patrolling police and soldiers would begin increasing. He went straight back to the Wind of Azure Inn and opened the door to the luxurious suite. Inside, he saw Gehrman Sparrow admiring the dusk. Danitz had a thought as he forced a smile. There's something. I forgot to mention it just now. Captain wishes to ask if you have any interest in meeting her at Galagos? This was a question he had previously kept secret. He had planned on returning and telling his captain that Gehrman Sparrow wasn't interested. But now, he realized that he had a low chance of surviving in Byam once he was separated from the crazy adventurer. Chapter 574. Failed to accomplish. Head to Galagos to meet Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina Edwards? Klein was taken aback, nearly frowning in the process. This wasn't something he considered unacceptable, but instead a chance for him to use this face-to-face meeting to ask about matters with trite details that were cumbersome to pen down. It was possible for him to be inspired and gain information for his subsequent advancement and high-sequence potion formulas. One more friend. One more channel. Klein silently muttered this sentence before taking out a heavy gold coin. He divined if there was any danger in front of blazing Danitz. The shiny gold coin flipped into the air and tumbled down into Klein's palm, tails facing up. This implied a negative response, which meant that there wasn't much danger meeting Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina in Galagos. Klein shifted his gaze upwards at Danitz and calmly said, "Okay. On the captain's behalf, I thank you for accepting the invitation." Danitz heaved a sigh of relief and beamed, his brows easing. Klein took a look at the wall clock and said, "I'll first head to the washroom." "Head to the washroom? You mean you plan on heading out later to buy a ticket for me?" Danitz's gaze followed Gehrman Sparrow's body as he sharply read in between the lines. After using spirit dowsing to confirm things above the gray fog, Klein washed his hands and left the washroom and said to Danitz, "Let's go." "Me?" Danitz pointed at himself. Klein put on his coat and nodded. "There's no need to, right? You can directly find Eland and get him to help us buy 2 tickets." In this rare occasion, Danitz sincerely provided a suggestion. Klein coldly swept his glance across him and didn't say a word. He wore his hat and went out the door. Danitz trembled and swallowed his second suggestion of buying fake identification documents, and used Gehrman Sparrow's ability to change appearances to buy 2 tickets via official channels. He wrapped the scarf around him once again and pressed down on his cap before quickly following Gehrman Sparrow. After nearly 20 minutes, Klein pointed ahead where there was a noisy commotion. "Is it there?" That was the seaweed bar where Danitz had failed to accomplish the purchase of scalped tickets. Yes. Danitz never expected them to circle over and was momentarily stunned. Along the way, he had roughly described his early experience. Therefore, he wasn't sure why Gehrman Sparrow would return here. Amid his thought, he suddenly had a guess as he blurted, "Are you going to seek revenge for me? This fellow might be crazy, but he's quite nice to his friends. His act of venturing out into Bansi Harbor for Eland and the others is an example." Danitz couldn't help but reflect on the matter. Klein shot him a glance and didn't say a word. He widened his strides and walked into the seaweed bar. "There's really no need," Danitz followed behind as he weakly persuaded him. To him, if he wasn't afraid of escalating the matter, he would have baked those bunch of backstabbing bastards in cement and sank them to the bottom of the sea. The bar was noisy and lively, with local music reverberating through it, bringing about a trance-like feeling. Danitz seriously surveyed the area in an attempt to find the bunch of backstabbers, as well as the infamous pirate, Blue Eyes Meath. "That's Daniel." Danitz casually introduced the black market merchant. "What a pity that this place is just too chaotic. I've no idea if that group of people are still around," he thought with some regret. Klein traced his gaze and touched creeping hunger with his right hand. He turned his head and looked at Danitz, saying with his usual expression, "Take off your scarf." His tone was akin to instructing Danitz to buy a glass of beer. Danitz was left stunned on the spot as he wondered if he had heard wrong. Klein widened the ends of his mouth and said, "Take off your scarf. Do not make me repeat thrice." "Why?" Danitz choked back his question under the icy cold and crazy stare. He blankly removed his scarf in puzzlement, and he had a baffling feeling that the people around him were sizing him up and also recognizing him as the great pirate worth 5,500 pounds, blazing Danitz. Klein maintained his smile that concealed madness and continued instructing, "Take off your cap. Go over and buy a ticket." In an instant, Danitz felt as though he had been struck by lightning. He nearly leaped up. "I'll be recognized." Under Gehrman Sparrow's stare, his voice became softer and softer. At this point in time, He had already understood what Gairman Sparrow was up to. He wishes to use my worth as £5,500 as bait to fish out those greedy pirates and powerhouses behind those gangs. Dogs hit. To think I thought he was nice to his friends a moment ago. No, why would I even consider him my friend? This son of a bitch. Danitz kept cursing inwardly with vulgarities. He couldn't put up any resistance since he knew how crazy Gairman Sparrow was. This was a madman who was even thinking of hunting a pirate admiral. Danitz revealed a twisted smile. As he slowly turned his head back, he took off his cap and slowly walked towards Daniel. Around him, gazes swept past him and paused for 2 seconds before they were retracted. As the drunkards moved away from him like the receding tide, they opened a wide path for him as though the ocean was split. Upon seeing their reaction, Danitz was surprised at this turn of events despite his horror and concerns. This is the might of a great pirate? This is what it feels like to be the center of attention? Damn it, I heard someone say my name. Someone is whispering blazing. Danitz knew he had been recognized. As he walked forward anxiously, he hung his hands down and prepared to do battle. Among the crowd, Blue Eyes Meath blurted out, Danitz? Blazing Danitz. His subordinates exchanged looks and said excitedly, Boss, it's really Blazing Danitz. £5,500. Shall we attack? Meath narrowed his azure blue eyes and raised his left arm, slapping the back of his subordinate's head. You stupid ass. If Blazing Danitz were a stupid ass like you, he would have been killed numerous times. He dared to appear here because he's not afraid of being attacked. He has a powerhouse hiding behind him? Meath suddenly felt horrified as he looked around. He suspected that Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina Edwards had secretly arrived in the city of generosity, Byam. Through the gaps in between the crowd, he saw a young gentleman in a black double-breasted frock coat. He wore a half-top hat and had black hair and brown eyes. He looked thin, but he had an angled face. Without any words, Meath's spiritual perception told him that this was a terrifying existence. His high spiritual perception had previously brought him numerous troubles, but it had also helped him successfully evade even more dangers. Let's go. He suppressed his voice as he ordered. Then, with the help of the patrons blocking him, he fled from the bar's back door just like how Danitz did previously. Danitz came right in front of Daniel while shuddering in fear before buying 2 tickets to Galagos from a blank and horrified opponent. Even after he returned the way he came and received the signal from Gairman Sparrow to walk out the bar, he didn't notice anyone suddenly assaulting him. Isn't it said that there are many desperados among pirates? Indeed, a last-minute and rushed trap is hardly effective. Something abnormal usually implies that something is amiss. Of course, one can use the abnormality to scare the enemy. Unfortunately, Klein pressed down on his hat before following Danitz out. At that moment in time, Danitz was loitering around a street lamp. When he saw Gairman Sparrow walk out, he barely smiled and said, Can I wear the scarf and cap already? Haha, that group of cowards. Yes. Klein didn't stop as he sped up once he reached the other end of the street. Danitz's pupils contracted as he hurriedly chased after him and inquired, Why are we suddenly running? Klein didn't turn his head as he calmly said, Do you wish to stay here to be invited back by the mandated punishers? As he spoke, he took out a paper figurine, threw it out, and burned it to ashes. Only then did Danitz snap to his senses. Although that group of cowards didn't dare to attack him, they definitely had the courage to report him. If he was successfully taken down, they still had a chance of receiving parts of the reward. They ran all the way into a secluded alley before Gairman Sparrow stopped. Only then did Danitz have the time to wrap his scarf properly and wear his cap. Where are we heading now? Danitz asked with a slight pant. Klein glanced at him. Find Elend. The corners of Danitz's mouth twitched, yearning to throw a fireball over. To buy tickets to the Dylinius Island, Klein added as he passed through the alley. Dylinius Island was the first island past the south of the Rorstad archipelago. Right, there's a ship there that heads for Galagos. Now, with everyone's attention focused on the liners from Byam to Galagos, no one would imagine that we'd take a detour to Dylinius Island and travel from there. Danitz followed as he was enlightened. On Tuesday morning, Klein personally helped Danitz don a disguise, making him look like a mixed blood who wore gold-rimmed glasses. Although there was no way to use his faceless powers, it was still at least 10 times better than Danitz's own attempts at disguising himself. They successfully boarded the ship and prepared to head south to Dylinius Island harbor. The journey was expected to take 10 hours. Whoosh!
The liner left the harbor and steered into the sea. Under the bright sunlight, thin clouds and blue skies, this hybrid-powered ship silently sailed through the gentle waves amid the cold breeze all the way into the afternoon. At this moment, Klein was inside the cabin, pondering over some content in the Book of Secrets. Danitz was pacing about, thinking about how he could brag to his mates. Suddenly, their vision darkened as though a cloud had drifted over to blot out the sun. Klein subconsciously looked out and saw that a gigantic pitch-black sailboat had appeared at some moment in time. It was nearly 100 meters long and had its sail fully opened. By the side were rows of cannons. Before it approached, it steered in a different direction, but it still made the surroundings seem to have a black sun pass by. Danitz revealed a reverent and apprehensive expression that was mixed with a longing but abhorrent look. He hissed before whispering in a dreamy manner, "Dark Emperor."
Chapter 575. Golden Dream. Upon seeing the gigantic black sailboat, Klein's first reaction was fear and wariness. He suspected that the demigod king of the five seas Nast was here for him, but he quickly refuted that guess. This was because, apart from using the Dark Emperor card in the spirit world, he had nearly never made the card of blasphemy appear in the real world ever since he came out to sea. There were only 2 or 3 times when they appeared due to a summoning before it quickly entered the spirit world. With the Grey Fog screening abilities and the card of blasphemy's anti-divination and anti-prophecy traits, it's impossible for Nast to lock on to me. Klein calmed down as he got up to walk towards the window. Together with Danitz, he looked at the Dark Emperor, which defied sailboat logic. The gigantic ship slowly approached in the massive shadows as the scene on the deck became increasingly clear. The sailors were either washing the deck or bragging on the shipboard. None of them had drawn their cutlasses or guns. There was no sign of them planning to plunder the ship. Near the cabin, there was a mottled stone chair that was 2 to 3 meters high. On it sat a colossal man that was comparable to a giant. Before he could take in Nast's appearance, Danitz couldn't help but lower his head as his body became numb and trembled, to the point of prostrating himself. Klein also sensed the inexplicable sense of might and awe. He didn't forcibly resist it to keep his head up and continue looking at Nast. This had a high chance of attracting his attention, bringing him unwanted trouble. As a person with many secrets, he had to bow his head when required. Klein retracted his gaze as he admired the rugs on the deck. After an unknown period of time, he saw the sunlight illuminate the area again as the shadow vanished. He looked up and could no longer see the gigantic pitch-black sailboat. The wind and seas were calm, and the skies were clear. Why would he suddenly be here? Wasn't it said that he was still at the Fog Sea recently? Danitz frowned as he muttered to himself in puzzlement. That Dark Emperor can cruise through the spirit world, so it's very normal for it to come all the way from the Fog Sea in a span of a few days. This is also probably one of the reasons why Nast is the greatest of the 4 kings. Klein thought to himself. He believed that Nast was lured by the Dark Emperor card, but it was likely that Nast could only determine a vague area. Klein retracted his gaze and sat back down as though nothing had happened. The straight-line distance between Byam and Dylinius wasn't great, but a sufficiently safe sea route was filled with twists and turns, so it took the liner until sunset before it reached the dock. After that, Klein changed his appearance and used a fake identity to buy 2 early tickets and set off before it got dark. They arrived at Gargas at dawn. Danitz didn't enter the city and instead brought Klein on a detour to a private harbor. They then took a simple fishing boat and set off to sea. After nearly 2 hours, Klein saw a sailboat which was dozens of meters long. It was clean and produced a golden luster from the sunlight reflected on it. Compared to similar sailboats, it appeared extremely special. Along the central axis was the main cannon, which was stacked with symbols and patterns. Faint but pure light swirled around it. That's the cannon of purification. It can only be used 10 times before 6 priests of light are needed to hold a ritual. They will pray to the corresponding deity to fill it up with spirituality. Danitz introduced smugly. A gigantic version of a charm? After a certain period of time, it will likely automatically lose its spirituality. Backing Vice Admiral Iceberg is the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun? Or one that can nurture priests of light? Klein's remained stoic as he mumbled inwardly. Back when he first saw the Golden Dream in Danitz's dream, he wasn't too surprised by the main cannon. After all, dreams didn't need to adhere to logic. Perhaps Danitz had seen an ironclad warship and its main cannon had left a deep impression on him, causing him to reproduce it in his dream. To Klein's surprise, The Golden Dream really had something that required extremely copious amounts of knowledge and mysticism. It wasn't something an ordinary faction could produce. Soon, the Golden Dream dispatched a dinghy and quickly steered towards the fishing boat. Danit spread his hands open before clenching them tightly. He then jumped down and landed in the dinghy without causing it to shake. He whistled and struck palms with the pirate who was steering. He found the former feeling of ruling over the ocean again. However, this excitement didn't last long as the dinghy behind him suddenly dipped a little. One more person had joined them. I forgot about that madman. Danitz wiped away his smile and sat down. Klein observed the pirates and pressed down his hat. He sat down calmly without a word. Before long, he landed on the deck of the Golden Dream and saw Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina Edwards standing in silence. This pirate admiral was nearly identical to how she looked when they met in the dream. There weren't any changes to her hair or looks. She now wore dark trousers with a pair of leather boots instead of wearing a dress. She also had a valiant bearing to her wisdom and beauty. She's more like a pirate this time than a teacher. Klein nodded gently and smiled politely. Good morning, ma'am, Captain. Good morning, Mr. Gehrman, Edwina replied with a smile. She turned around and walked to a spot where fishing nets were being hung out to dry. She signaled the pirates to walk away and get busy with their own work. Fishing nets. As expected of a pirate crew that's more like treasure hunters. This is in preparation to improve their meals? Klein followed in silence. Danitz very naturally found a few of his companions he was most familiar with to have drinks and to brag too. Of course, he didn't let down his guard. From time to time, he would glance over, afraid that his captain would end up exchanging blows with Gehrman Sparrow. He was ready to get his companions to join the brawl at any moment. This time, Klein didn't wait for Edwina to explain why she had invited him. After 2 seconds of silence he asked, "What do you know of Tracy?" He planned on asking all his questions before listening to Edwina's motives. He wanted to prevent himself from being embarrassed to ask further after rejecting a request he couldn't agree to. Tracy? Edwina's eyes quivered a little. She's a demoness, a sequence 5 demoness of affliction. Demoness? Klein nearly lost it. He felt that his fate seemed to be intertwined with demonesses. First, it was Witch Trissy, and then there was Demoness of Pleasure Madame Sharon, and then there was Demoness of Pleasure Trissy Cheek, and a high-ranking demoness he only heard the voice of. Now, there was another demoness of affliction, Tracy. Edwina didn't sense the upheavals he was going through and continued. She's different from the typical demoness. She has her own ideals and pursuits. She's quite an oddity in the demoness sect. However, she would still work for the organization doing work such as human trafficking or something else. Different from the typical demoness? She doesn't give up on herself and chooses to give pleasure to women? Klein suddenly thought of red-haired Helene. However, he couldn't be certain because not every demoness was the result of a man changing into a woman. There were real women who wished to become an assassin. After asking for the details, Klein deliberated and asked, "We met Nast and his Dark Emperor on the way here. In the recent months, matters involving you, Senor, Tracy, and Nast have happened in this area of the sea. This is rather abnormal. For out of the 4 kings and 7 admirals had involved themselves in the Rorsted Sea in a short span of time. This wasn't even including the recently recruited Tarot Club member, Admiral of Stars Catlia. In terms of probability, this was indeed quite abnormal. Of course, Klein had some theories, but he wished to see if Vice Admiral Iceberg was able to provide some fresh insight. Edwina listened without saying a word. She pulled the edge of a fishing net and held it in front of her. She took out a fountain pen, a brass dagger, metallic bottles, and other things from her pockets and the inner section of her belt and placed them on the spread-out net. They latched on firmly without moving. It didn't seem like there would be any interaction between them. At this moment, Edwina bent over and picked up a rock used to press down the net, and she placed it in the middle of the open net. The net immediately depressed, causing the surroundings to contract. The fountain pen, dagger, and bottles tumbled towards the center and gathered beside the rock. It's probably something like this. Some unknown existence has appeared in the net of fate and is pulling us towards it, Edwina explained simply. This is like an actual model of the law of convergence for beyonder characteristics. Klein thought as he nodded. With regards to this, he was both enlightened but puzzled as well. He was enlightened because Edwina's explanation was nearly the same as his guess, but he was puzzled because it couldn't be used to analyze the problems. The King of the 5 Seas Nast appeared because of me. Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy can also be barely explained, since I did come into contact with Xueqi.
As for Vice Admiral Iceberg and Admiral of Blood, I can't find a reason.
Perhaps it's purely a coincidence? Besides, it's the latter that attracted the former out.
Klein retracted his gaze and asked about something else. Then he said, "Ma'am Captain, is there a reason for inviting me here?"
Edwina gave him a deep look and said, "Your identity indicates that you came from Backland. According to what I know, this identity isn't authentic enough. There's no powerful bounty hunter named Gehrman Sparrow from there. The faction backing you is very powerful. Furthermore, it has quite an extensive network in Backland. You managed to so quickly notice a problem with my identity." Klein didn't panic as he smiled calmly. "Everyone will have some secrets." Edwina remained silent for a few seconds without pressing the issue. She then said, "Not long before Calvetua died, you sacrificed something to it." Klein turned his head slightly and swept his gaze across Danitz, who was drinking beer. Cough, cough. Alarmed, Danitz spewed the beer all over himself.
Klein retracted his gaze and didn't deny or admit it as he looked at Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina.
Edwina continued without a change in expression. "After Calvetua died, the Psi god is still replying to its believers." Chapter 576. Vice Admiral Iceberg's collector's room. Is she suspecting something? Klein looked straight into Edwina's eyes without moving them away. Nor did his eyes blink or dodge. After knowing that Danitz had divulged his sacrificial ritual to Calvetua before it died, Klein had the necessary preparations. If he wasn't standing on the shipboard and was instead sitting on a soda, then he definitely would have crossed his right leg and leaned back to give a calm and composed answer. He smiled as he raised his left hand. He introduced with a calm tone, "This glove of mine is called Creeping Hunger." Klein believed that Danitz, who had witnessed him in combat, had definitely passed the relevant details on to his captain.
Therefore, with Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina being of equal rank as Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos, it wasn't difficult for her to guess that he had acquired Creeping Hunger.
In that case, taking the initiative to divulge it gave him a psychological advantage rather than being exposed by her. And for him to suddenly mention it gave it a double meaning. First, he was hinting to her that he had an organization backing him, one that could kill Vice Admiral Hurricane and orchestrate Calvetua's death and reply to its believers in its stead. Second, it was a warning for Edwina that she was not to attempt to investigate or delve deeper into the matter. Otherwise, the instantaneous death of Vice Admiral Hurricane awaited her. At this moment in time, Klein continued maintaining Gehrman Sparrow's persona. He didn't directly threaten her or refuse to admit it. Instead, he provided a calm answer that hid madness within it. Edwina Edwards nodded slightly and suddenly changed topics. "I plan on providing a certain amount of assistance to the resistance in the Rorstad archipelago, mainly in food and fabric." Assistance? Her backing faction is against loan, or it just wants to make things difficult for the Church of Storms? Klein wiped his smile and calmly replied, "This has nothing to do with me. Don't expect me to trip up," he said silently to himself. Edwina turned her head and raised her arm to point to blazing Danitz, who was drinking while secretly stealing glances. "I will entrust him to handle it, including contacting the resistance and confirming the time. We'll arrange for a private harbor, and I wish you can provide sufficient help." Danitz spewed out a golden waterfall from his mouth. "Ha! Bam, bam, bam." The two pirates sitting beside him laughed as they bent their backs and struck the deck, spewing out the beer that they had just drunk. One of them had dark skin, like he was covered in a layer of metal skin. His waist was rather thick, and although he wasn't fat, he had no curvature to speak of. Edwina retracted her gaze and added in an unhurried manner before Klein could speak, "You're an adventurer. I believe you won't decline a job that pays well." "You really have found me an excellent excuse." Klein smiled in response. Of course. He didn't ask how much the payment was, while Edwina seemed to forget mentioning it. This intelligent and beautiful pirate admiral gloomily said, "Senor got someone to pass me the news that he's willing to buy the key of the giants, which I previously discovered, for 5,000 pounds. It was the item proclaimed to be Death's Key. It was a gigantic black iron key that nearly made Danitz lose his life in Byam. Klein suspected that it didn't originate from the Dark Second Epoch, but it was something that was connected to the Giant King's court. She's hinting at me to offer a price? Klein was first taken aback before he came to a realization. He couldn't help but inwardly mumble, 5,000 pounds? I don't even know if the key is of any use, or if it really involves the Giant King's court. If it doesn't have anything to do with it, can I return it for a refund? Besides, there's no prior information about it. Even if I take it above the gray fog to divine it, I wouldn't receive any effective revelations. Yes, a simple inference is that if it doesn't involve the giant king's court but some other treasure that I have no idea about, then it would be useless if I buy it. The only benefit is that it will disrupt Admiral of Blood's plans. It harms him without benefiting me. If it involves the giant king's court, Admiral of Blood is unlikely to find the target location even if he bought it, as it's located in the forsaken land of the gods. Besides, I plan to hunt him. When the time comes, I can obtain the key without spending any money. It's equivalent to having him buy it for me and watch over it for some time. Although such thoughts are very idealistic, it's not impossible. Klein pondered for a few seconds and said, "It might be hiding a huge secret." He deliberately mentioned this to make Vice Admiral Iceberg unwilling to sell the gigantic black iron key to Admiral of Blood Senior.
It was to prevent the latter from rapidly strengthening himself after obtaining the treasure and step into the demigod realm. That would bring a considerable calamity upon Klein.
Edwina listened silently and didn't continue on the topic. She turned her body halfway around and pointed at the cabin's entrance.
"Breakfast has been prepared for you."
"Thank you." Klein took off his hat and bowed.
As he followed Vice Admiral Iceberg into the cabin, he quickly recalled the conversation they just had and sought out the true motive behind Edwina's invitation. From Gehrman Sparrow's identity problems, to the mystical item suspected to be creeping hunger, to the matter of the sacrifice to Calvetua while the Dead Sea God continued responding to believers, all of these matters put together does allow one to imagine that I have a secret organization backing me, one whose motives are unknown. As for the faction that Vice Admiral Iceberg belongs to, it's very wary, guarded, and interested in this matter.
Therefore, it got her to probe me in person to see if they can obtain something? They're still rather friendly at the moment. Extending their assistance to the resistance is a way to convey their intentions. It seems they're leaning towards cooperating with the organization backing me. Of course, the unknown always leaves others afraid. Without grasping the situation, the chances of Vice Admiral Iceberg and company attacking me is very, very low. Haha, if they realize that the secret organization backing me was established only about half a year ago, including the World and Miss Zio, whose connection has been established but not recruited, there aren't more than 10 people. I wonder if they will get so infuriated that they end up losing control. As his thoughts raced, Klein entered the cabin and followed a dim passageway, passing through one wooden door after another. He followed Edwina up some stairs and arrived at a brighter second level. Before entering the pirates' dining hall, they passed by a half-opened room. Klein casually glanced inside and saw a gigantic black iron key sitting on a wooden table. These items are evidence from our various treasure hunting expeditions. Most of them are mementos, while others have yet to show their value and require further study. Edwina appeared cold, but her explanations were in great detail. It had the feeling like she was afraid that he wouldn't understand her or was left puzzled.
And when she mentioned the word study, her aqueous blue eyes clearly lit up a little.
Evidence of the various treasure hunting expeditions? Klein couldn't help but look inside carefully. At this point, Edwina pushed open the door and walked in. She then introduced in passing, "This is a gold coin from the 4th epoch Solomon Empire." Klein's gaze shifted over and saw a coin placed inside a frame. It was entirely dark gold in color, as though it was combined from two semicircles of different dimensions. It looked extremely asymmetrical, and there was a sharp crown engraved on its surface. It looked very similar to the crown worn on the King of the Five Seas, Nast. Edwina was like an owner who liked to flaunt her collection.
She began introducing the items in the room, making Klein recall a familiar person, old Mr. Eye of Wisdom, the great detective, Isengard Stanton. In regards to the trait of flaunting collections, they're very similar. Is this a tendency of people with huge collections? Wait, Mr. Stanton had studied in Lemberg for 4 years. Vice Admiral Iceberg's description includes information that Edwina Edwards that hails from Lemberg. Lemberg's capital is the headquarters of the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. Mr. Stanton also admitted that he converted his faith to the God of Knowledge and Wisdom while studying abroad. Could the faction backing Vice Admiral Iceberg be them? Klein listened in thought until Edwina stopped in front of the huge iron black key. Just like he had seen in the dream, the key was about the size of a 7-string zither. An ordinary human would have to wrap their arms around it to move it. It was dull and ancient looking. The patterns on it are similar to the City of Silver style.
It clearly has giant traits. Klein nodded and was just about to retract his gaze when he heard Edwina say, "You can study it." "You are letting me study it? You probably have no idea how many latent problems I've triggered in the past. Aren't you afraid that the golden dream will disappear once you let me study it?"
Klein criticized himself in a self-deprecatory manner before reaching out his right hand to touch the black iron key that seemed to belong to a giant's.
He found it ice-cold to the touch, and regardless of how much spirituality he injected into it, it was useless.
"Unfortunately, I cannot bring it above the gray fog to study it."
Klein retracted his right hand and shook his head indiscernibly. He shifted his gaze onto a book in goatskin placed on the same table. On the brown cover were words written in ancient Faesac, Grozel's Travels. "It originates from a sunken ship.
It had been soaked at the bottom of the sea for 165 years without suffering any damage," Edwina introduced.
"It records a story about a giant named Grozel. He had decided to head to the nation of Frost to hunt the King of the North, a powerful frost dragon. Along the way, he encounters companions, a female elf, a devout ascetic, an aristocrat of the Solomon Empire, and a lone soldier. The story develops until they encounter the King of the North before it suddenly comes to a halt. It's not the end, but the later pages cannot be opened no matter what methods are used. You can give it a try. This isn't a notebook in a journal style, but rather a novel? This novel sure is odd. It puts together characters from different epochs and eras. It should be something that was recently produced." Klein flipped through the book and allowed the yellowish-brown pages to slide past one after another. The content was roughly what Edwina said, but the story appeared rather abrupt and fractured. It kept making Klein suspect if he had missed a paragraph. For example, the protagonists would become familiar with one another moments after encountering each other as strangers. Soon, he browsed to the last few pages and found that they were stuck together. There was no way he could pry them apart. Such effects probably can be dealt with above the gray fog. I wonder what sort of accidents might happen.
Klein turned his head to look at Vice Admiral Iceberg. Edwina fell silent for a moment before saying, "If you wish to have it, I can sell it to you."
I've studied it for years without gleaning anything from it. However, I have a condition.
"What is it?"
Klein returned with a question.
Edwina pursed her lips and said, "If you figure out something, you have to tell me the result, so that I won't have to be puzzled over it."
As long as you agree to this condition, I can sell it to you for cheap. Klein's interest was suddenly piqued.
"How much?"
£8,000, Edwina said calmly.
Klein deliberately pondered as he nodded indifferently.
"I'll consider it.
I'll consider how to pretend that this never happened." He thought silently to himself. Chapter 577. Book from more than 3,000 years ago. Vice Admiral Iceberg. Edwina didn't show any changes in her expression when she heard Gairman Sparrow say that he needed to consider it.
She nodded calmly. "No hurry. She seems to feel that I'm unable to make the decision regarding a transaction of this scale, and that I need to seek advice from the secret organization backing me. Is this a problem of me not being able to make the decision? This is a problem of not having the money." Klein lampooned and closed Grozel's Travels. He asked in a deep voice, "Do you know who the author is? What happened to the people who last possessed this book?" Edwina walked in front of him and reached out her right hand. She rubbed the cover with her fingertip and said, "The owners from before cannot be identified, as the sinking of the ship has resulted in the relevant information being lost to history. Similarly, we are unable to confirm who the author is. Oh, the book doesn't include the author's name. I've used some mystical arts to study it and discovered that the goatskin was created at least 3,000 years ago, before the cataclysm. This is why I believe it's worth at least £8,000. A book from 3,000 years ago. There's a dragon, an elf, and a human ascetic, a Solomon Empire noble, and a lone soldier. These are all concepts from years later. A magical book that contains the power of prophecy? Or did someone specially use an ancient goatskin to create it? But it's meaningless to do so. It's purely a hoax?"
Klein deliberately curled the corners of his mouth without any intent of smiling.
"The giant's name is Grozel. Could the author be Roselle?" "No, Roselle's name originated from a root word in Jotun. When ancient Faesac evolved into Intis, there was a second change, making it have a different meaning." Edwina explained in detail the origins of Roselle's name. It left Klein stunned as he felt like he was back in school.
He nodded gently and said in an unperturbed tone, "If it's an ancient piece of work, I'm very curious as to why a frost dragon would be named the King of the North.
What sequence and pathway does it correspond to? Edwina raised her gaze from Grozel's travels and looked at Klein. Before the appearance of the first blasphemy slate, there was no concept of sequences and pathways. Furthermore, many creatures didn't abide by such arrangements. In that epoch, chaos and mania was the basic attitude to everything. Some dragons might gather many beyonder characteristics related to frost, just like a demoness frost, a zombie's frost, and a weather warlock's frost. As such, it would possess rather powerful strength and a relatively high level. Of course, such a gathering would definitely lead to death and a loss of control. This means that if it doesn't die, it would definitely lose control and become a monster.
However, a dragon is a monster in and of itself. If there are many similar products of this sort from the dragons, giants, and elves, then it can be understood why the second epoch is known as the Dark Epoch. Klein pondered for a moment and inquired as though he was talking to himself. This results in the wastage of beyonder characteristics.
Edwina looked at him for a few seconds.
Emperor Roselle once said this. Whatever separates will definitely converge, and whatever converges will definitely separate.
The Emperor said that before? I understand the first part. That's another form of saying the law of convergence of beyonder characteristics. But what does the second part mean?
After the convergence happens to a certain extent, it would tend to separate and dissociate.
When one doesn't belong to a particular pathway, the extremely chaotic convergent mix will cause a dissociation.
The more chaotic it is, the more repulsion there is between the characteristics.
Such words aren't likely to be said to anyone. It definitely isn't something that's spread out in the public.
Last time, I guessed from the Vice Admiral's usage of the Roselle's dream spell, and her last name that she's a descendant of one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, Edwards.
It's extremely possible.
After the Emperor perished, their family escaped to Lenberg and gradually converted their faith to the god of knowledge and wisdom.
What a good teacher. She answers any question.
Klein didn't speak further as he continued admiring Vice Admiral Iceberg's collection.
At the same time, he had some thoughts.
He planned on asking Little Sun via the world during the tarot gathering if he knew of the book, Grozel's Travels. Of course, in order to prevent the hanged man from sensing something problematic with the world and hence, figure out that something was amiss with the fool, he decided to communicate in private while blocking everyone else. After a brief excursion of the room, Edwina led Klein out and entered the captain's room in the dining hall.
The relatively special food here is yogurt. You can add strawberry jam and other things. You can also directly add honey. Edwina pointed to the row of food outside. There's some dried fish that isn't bad. They come from the deep sea, species that have yet to be named.
As she spoke, she gestured for Klein to take the food for himself to bring back to the room.
She then got up and made herself an example. Klein took some yogurt of unknown origins and added a few spoonfuls of honey. Then, he carried his tray and placed pork sausages, buttered bread, and other food on it.
During this process, he saw a young man dressed in a white shirt and black vest, decked out with a flowery bow tie, looking more like an office worker than a pirate, approach Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina and have a hushed exchange with her.
The man had pretty good looks with almost blonde hair other than his slightly black hair roots. His hair was neatly combed to the sides.
His eyes were a very light lake green color, and his nose was sharp. He had thin lips and that made him exude a trustworthy vibe.
Don't be fooled by that guy's appearance. He's a wolf-fish can. He stinks deep down.
Danitz whispered in contempt, having entered the pirate's dining hall and arriving beside Klein at some point in time. Klein turned his head and glanced at him without saying a word.
This was because he knew Danitz would offer to explain without him egging him on.
Without waiting for Danitz to speak, a man with a swollen waist beside him said with a crude and sharp voice, "He's the third mate, Jodson.
He used to be a Casanova and part-time pirate, saying that he would steal our captain's heart, but he ended up getting a beating. He ended up staying to be educated. Dog's hit. In short, he's a bad egg." Danitz emphasized. "He's a bad egg," another pirated with iron-black skin echoed. "Why do I have the nagging feeling that all of you are the same?"
Klein thought and said, "Flowery bow tie Jodson with a bounty of 5,200 pounds?
Sequence 6? As expected of the standard Gehrman Sparrow reaction.
Danitz glanced to the side as a lingering sense of fear was hidden within his contempt.
"He's not that strong, but he's very strange."
"In my brawls with him, no, when in combat, fireballs suddenly can't be used, and he will be able to replicate my fire powers."
A very familiar description. Klein subconsciously glanced towards Jodson. After some careful thought, he recalled the familiarity. This is very similar to the sealed artifact, Blood Vessel Thief, found behind Tinjin City's Chinese Gate. Klein had already forgotten the Blood Vessel Thief sealed artifact number, but he still remembered clearly that it could temporarily steal a person's beyonder powers for themselves. The corresponding pathway?
Klein retracted his gaze and discovered that Danitz and his two companions were drinking while looking in that direction.
Thinking back to how Danitz divulged his sacrifice to Calvetua, Klein took a cup of beer and carried his food tray towards the captain's dining room. He said indifferently, "All of you like her, right?" Behind Klein, there was the sound of alcohol being spewed out at the same time.
He saw Danitz jump backward through the corner of his eye, looking at him in horror before turning his head in relief to size up his companions. They had unknowingly opened up a gap between themselves as the look in their eyes turned complicated. They looked like they had the fury of being fooled. Klein didn't stop. He returned to the captain's dining room and enjoyed breakfast. After a while, Edwina carried a meal tray back. She drank a mouthful of milk and paused before saying, "Danitz showed me the summoning ritual of your messenger.
It mentions that 1 gold coin is a necessary component. I'm somewhat perplexed. Does it refer to lone gold coins, or those from Intis, Faysac, or somewhere else? Their weights are all different, and the amount of gold they contain is different." Klein thought for a moment before saying, "Lone's gold coin. This is also the gold coin that's worth the most. It's not like I need to pay for it myself," Klein added inwardly. Edwina nodded. "Payment also needs to be done when receiving a reply? Different spirit world creatures have different hobbies," Klein said. He knew that Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina was a researcher of spirit world creatures, and he believed that she could understand what he meant. Furthermore, he wasn't lying. He just hid the fact that the messenger's owner could also pay for it. "Yes," Edwina very seriously answered him. "I once attempted to find a messenger, but I could only use trial and error for the incantation. Not only was it dangerous, but it was very difficult to satisfy the requirements. I eventually had to give up. This is one of the reasons. The other reason is that simulating the power of the undead isn't enough to sign the contract. Your incantation has given me quite the inspiration." Klein ate his breakfast in silence without explaining anything. This was because this was the knowledge he had learned from Mr. Azek. He wasn't at liberty to teach it to others without receiving permission from him. After a delicious and quiet breakfast, the Golden Dream approached a private harbor and dropped Klein and Danitz off. Danitz looked back at the glimmering golden ship and suddenly sighed. "I feel like my friendship has sunk into the ocean." Klein pressed down on his hat and calmly said, "Losers can always form alliances among themselves." Danitz was unsure whether he should be happy or sad. After changing their identities and creating fake identification, they successfully bought tickets back to Byam and boarded the ship. Klein finally had a private space for himself.
He entered the washroom and went above the gray fog and began scanning through the believers' prayers.
This time, the first thing that appeared before him was the bald member of the resistance, Kalot. "Honorable God, we have discovered the whereabouts of red-haired Helene. She's currently hiding in the Intis embassy. This has been confirmed by a laundry maid and gardener. You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories."